Okay, son. Your mother and I think you're old enough that you can pick what you want to watch.
Pretty.
No, Sammy, it has to be done. It has to get done. Sammy, it has to
I
be done.
have worked
You don't
on this
understand. Avatar: The Last Airbender was a cartoon aired on Nickelodeon starting on February 21st of 2005. The show had 3 seasons, concluding with a 4-part finale on July 19th, 2008. The seasons are often referred to as books, as in Book 1 Water, Book 2 Earth, and so I will be referring to seasons as books from this point forward. Each book had between 20 and 21 episodes, and each episode was made for TV, meaning it was a strict 22 minutes long each episode. After the wild success of the show, M. Night Shyamalan of all people directed and produced The Last Airbender, releasing on July 1st, 2010. It was...
Oh, hell no, man.
Yeah, I'm not gonna waste any time talking about it. Still, people yearned for more Avatar content, and we got Legend of Korra, releasing its first episode on April 14th, 2012, and its last episode on December 19th, 2014. Which finally brings us to the most recent Avatar media content, Netflix's adaptation of Avatar: The Last Airbender, releasing in full on February 22nd, 2024, which is 1 day and 19 years after the original aired. Although it released in 2024, the show was officially announced on September 18th, 2018, so it was in the works for a while. It consisted of 8 episodes total, each between 41 and 58 minutes. For the sake of clarity during this video, I'll be referring to the original Avatar as the cartoon and the Netflix adaptation as the show. It would have been helpful if they were different names, but you know, whatever. Oh, and yeah, you may have noticed there's a floating baby head on the Netflix adaptation of my favorite show. The Netflix show is the only part of this video that gets copyright claimed. The floating baby helps prevent that. He's my son, Corbin. I understand that it's a little oppressive. I'm sorry for the artistic hit that my video has to take for this. If you want to see the unedited video, it's available for $1 on my Patreon. The link is in the description. The cartoon was created by Brian Konietzko and Michael DiMartino, with the help of Aaron Ehasz as the head writer. Some of the episodes were even directed by Dave Filoni. You know, the Clone Wars Dave Filoni, pretty dope. The story goes that Brian and Mike were part of the Netflix adaptation since its inception, with Netflix promising to honor the wishes of the 2 original creators. That is until June 2020, when they apparently left the project citing creative differences. Broadly, the news of a Netflix adaptation of Avatar: The Last Airbender was met with skeptical optimism. People were excited to see what Netflix would do with it. Except me. No, not me. I've been so burnt out on remakes and reboots, I was really pessimistic about Netflix's ability to replicate what was literally my favorite show growing up. But alas, here we are. I have seen the show, and it's... well, damn, it's different, let's say that. But similar to my Invincible videos, I was curious on why they were different. What could be the reasoning behind making the Cave of Two Lovers in Season 1? What could have been the reasoning behind making Aang not actually waterbend in the book titled Water? You know, decisions that sounded crazy on paper, and even crazier in implementation. I was also curious about which episodes got adapted. If the Netflix show was only going to have 8 episodes, they would have had to cut corners somewhere, right? The creators of the show made it clear that this is a retelling and a remix, so it's obviously not going to be 1-to-1. But even still, I was too curious to see which references, storylines, arcs, plots, and episodes made it into the Netflix version. So that's what we're going to talk about today. This video in particular is going to be broken up into 2 sections for each episode. One to go over each episode chronologically and explain which scenes, events, and conversations line up with the cartoon, and one section to explain why the changes were made. So let's get started discovering just what is so different about Netflix's Avatar. Netflix's Avatar has its opening frame as this unnamed comet traveling through the night sky. Yes, unnamed. Why would it be called Sozin's Comet before Sozin uses it to destroy the air nomads? I think the show calls it the Great Comet, but it also never uses the term Sozin's Comet, so whatever. To start us off, the first appearance of this comet, Sozin or otherwise, is in Book 1, Episode 7, when Roku's dragon reveals it to Aang in an image. Now, the panning shot of Capital City. First off, unimaginative name. You have a race of people who can control fire, living on an island with a volcano as its center. Call that bitch Capital City. I actually can't blame the show for this though, because that was the name they gave it in the cartoon. Anyway, we don't get to see the Fire Nation capital until episode 12 of Book 1, but it's unnamed in that episode. Now, this whole beginning sequence about an Earthbender running away from the Fire Nation is nowhere to be found in the cartoon. The first time we see Earthbenders fight Firebenders is in episode 6, when the Fire Nation labor camp rises up against their oppressors. Same with his capture and conversation with Firelord Sozin. There's only one conversation Firelord Sozin has with anybody regarding his plans for future conquest, and that's Avatar Roku in episode 6 of Book 3. The specific battle plans to alert the Earth Kingdom of an upcoming attack is not in the cartoon either. The Fire Nation's attack on the air nomads comes completely and utterly by surprise. Before that, the only signs of conflict that existed were the occupation of an Earth Kingdom colony, but that was 25 years before Roku's death. Again, all from episode 6 of Book 3. There's no scene in the cartoon quite as dramatic as the camera zooming into Firelord Sozin's face saying, "We will kill them all." The rest of the conversation isn't mentioned anywhere in the cartoon either. Now, the opening of the Netflix show is very different upon direct comparison. In the cartoon, water was represented by Master Paku, but in the show it's represented by, this random water tribe guy. Earth was represented by the boulder, but since he hadn't been shown in the show yet, I mean, this could be him, I don't know. Fire in both is represented by Azula, so that's cool. The cartoon, however, saves air for Aang, but in the show it's an unnamed female airbending monk. Hard to tell as well, but is she a master? Where are her tattoos? All the cartoon settings were in what I'm gonna call a blackout studio, because that's what you would use if you wanted to make this in real life. However, the show makes it a more realistic environment environment for this title sequence. And before we move on to the actual story part, Katara voices the voiceover in the cartoon, but in the show it's Kyoshi, I guess. That's how the subtitles label her anyway. This is actually a really important detail, as the cartoon makes this prologue told from Katara's point of view, giving the audience a kind of surrogate to see the world through their eyes. She uses words like my father and my grandmother. In the cartoon, we the audience are only given secondhand information from what Katara was told by her grandmother, but the show presents this information as narration, not a retelling. Both versions of the story tell how the Avatar keeps balance in the world, but the show takes it further by explaining the reincarnation cycle, while the cartoon saves this revelation for later, episode 3. By having the cartoon make Katara our narrator, we're put into the present, as Katara explains the state of the world now, and how the Fire Nation arrived there. However, the show decides to do this retelling in the past, before Sozin launches his attack. The show then also does this interesting graphic for each episode's title, while the cartoon instead has the same intro for every single episode, the title cards that look like this. Now, the Southern Air Temple is seen in episode 3 of book 1, the first episode after the pilot. The biggest difference is that in the cartoon, it's told from the present with only slight flashbacks. The show has the entire scene set in the past. Aang, flying, is unfortunately taken from the cartoon, but it's not Avatar: The Last Airbender, it's Legend of Korra. I try really hard not to think about Legend of Korra because the only redeemable part of that show in my eyes is the really high-definition bending battles that happen, but I do have to bring it up because it is undoubtedly part of the canon. I will say that it's never Aang who flies via airbending, unless you want to count the Avatar bubble that he was in the finale, but I don't. Boy was in a bubble. This also serves as Aang's introduction into the series. Anyway, Gyatso makes his first appearance in the cartoon in that same episode, but in that episode, the two have a conversation about what it means now that Aang has been told he's the Avatar. Meanwhile, in the show, they instead talk about Aang skipping his training. So yeah, about that, pop quiz. Do you know what the tribal tattoos of the air nomads symbolize? Because I do. They symbolize the mastering of an element, meaning as far as I understand mastery, no more training would be required. I actually have no idea why Gyatso would refer to Aang as a student. He isn't. He's mastered airbending already. Now, in fairness, in the cartoon, he does refer to Aang as his young pupil, but I think that's more of a sign of respect and not a position in their society. Like how you still call your teacher master after you've mastered the element yourself. In the show, Gyatso talks about the Great Comet Festival. This is exclusive to the show, and no celebration of the comet exists in the cartoon, not even from the Fire Nation. Which also means that the other airbenders convening here is exclusive to the show as well. There's no scene in the cartoon about Gyatso knowing that Aang is the Avatar and not telling him. However, the following scene about Gyatso talking to the council is taken from the cartoon in episode 12, during a flashback when Aang spies on their meeting. The very beginning of the conversation about Aang needing recreational time and to be a kid is true in both mediums, and they do share some parallels when they talk about how war is brewing and the Avatar will be needed soon. However, Aang is actually present for this conversation in the cartoon, not the show. The decision to send Aang away is from the cartoon, but there, he's sent to a different air nomad temple, which I assume is to begin his Avatar training, but in the show, he's to be sent away to begin learning the other elements. Oh, here's something neat. The statue of Avatar Yang Chen is a statue in the cartoon, but she's not at the Southern Air Temple where Aang grew up. She's in the Eastern Air Temple, which is only revealed in episode 19 of book 2, partially destroyed. The conversation Aang has with Gyatso about his tattoos and him being the Avatar is exclusive to the show. It does have roots again in episode 12, but they actually skip past directly telling him and instead go into the explanation of how they know, citing some toys he played with that his past lives have enjoyed as well. This is evidence that is excluded from the show. The character arc that they're setting up for Aang about him being special and remembering who he is isn't in the cartoon either. More on that in a bit. Gyatso saying that Aang will always be his friend possibly has roots in the cartoon. Okay, truthfully, I might be stretching here, but it's a cute-ass fact, so I'm gonna share it. Avatar Roku and Gyatso were friends when he was learning his airbending training, so him saying I will always be your friend is a beautiful testament to that. Possibly. I'm gonna believe so. Aang reiterating to Appa that he's the Avatar and doesn't want that responsibility is exclusive to the show. He does talk about these feelings sporadically in the cartoon with Katara, but not quite as, let's say clearly as it was in the show. More on that in the next section. Aang taking a trip on Appa to clear his head is, let's say, remixed from the cartoon. Aang does take a trip on Appa, but it's specifically to run away from home, and from the responsibility of becoming the Avatar. He even leaves a note for Gyatso. In the show, I don't think he ever planned to run away. Sozin's attack on the air temples is absent from the cartoon. The only image we see of it directly is episode 6 of book 3, when Zuko reads the past history of Fire Lord Sozin, but it's just an image, not a fight sequence. The Fire Nation tech of being able to fly by expelling a huge amount of fire from your hands and feet is the primary mobility tool of Phoenix King Ozai in the finale of the cartoon, but it has popped up a few times before that by Azula. It seems to be similar to lightning, in that not just any old Joe can do it. The only thing to mention about this fight is that Aang gets caught in a storm and goes under, trapping him in an iceberg. We get to see this directly in episode 1 of the cartoon, as a nightmare that Aang is having. The scene where Gyatso dies is interesting because Fire Lord Sozin says that they have the power of the comet, but this is actually the first time in the show that this is mentioned. There hasn't been any direct explanation that the comet makes the firebender stronger. Another side effect of not having Katara do the narration for the show is that the scene that introduces her and Sokka doesn't actually clarify that 100 years have passed. We watch Gyatso get torched and then we just flash to Katara practicing waterbending by herself. Her being unable to form a ball of water is our introduction to this character. It should be noted that she's practicing in the husk of the Fire Navy ship, which is part of episode 1 of the cartoon, but there it's specifically mentioned mention that no one visits it because it's, number one, a scar for her people, but number two, potentially filled with booby traps. Wolf Cove is shown in size and scale in both mediums, but it looks like this in the show and this in the cartoon. Katara even specifically says,
"This is the entire village."
So the scale is much bigger in the show. The next scene introduces Sokka, scolding the other men of the tribe for being irresponsible. This scene is lifted directly from episode 1 as well, except the kids are notably younger in the cartoon.
"I gotta pee."
They're also co-ed in the show, it seems, but exclusively boys in the cartoon? I think? It's hard to tell sometimes. After this, Sokka and Katara set out on a fishing boat, being displeased at the fishers who already went out, and Katara mocks Sokka's leadership abilities. In the cartoon, the order of these scenes is switched, making Sokka and Katara in the fishing boat their introduction to the show, and the scene about Sokka being a leader a bit later. Now, by the numbers, the Netflix show is finally ready to establish our supporting protagonists at 22 minutes, while the cartoon was able to establish them at minute 2. Just saying. Katara's power levels are also significantly different in the cartoon versus the show. In the cartoon, she catches a fish in a bubble as the opening scene. Absolutely no training necessary. This is her level 0. But in the show, she can't actually form a bubble at her level 0. Keep that in mind for later. Now, Sokka's attitude about Katara's waterbending is different in both mediums. In the cartoon, he views it as burdensome and trouble for him whenever she does it. In the show, he sees it as dangerous because someone from the Fire Nation could see them. The fact that the Fire Nation kidnapped all the waterbenders of the South Pole is not something that was talked about in the cartoon until much, much later. The closest we get in episode 1 is Katara saying that she is the only waterbender in the South Pole, but there's no explanation given as to why. The rapids taking our protagonist by surprise is the next beat in both mediums. However, in the cartoon, their boat is destroyed, while in the show, it just begins floating away. Quick cutaway to Zuko's Fire Navy ship, where we reveal his notebook that he's scribbling in. It comes up later, so let's get it out of the way now. Zuko doesn't have a notebook in the cartoon. I've got words to say about it later, but for now, let's just get back to my two favorite water tribers. Katara takes her gloves off to waterbend the boat back to them, a little detail that was actually lifted right from the cartoon, so good job. In the show, she's able to get a firm grasp on the boat and begins bringing it back to them. This awakens the Avatar spirit, I guess, because once he was in the iceberg, the only thing that could free him was the presence of another bender. But because the Southern Water Tribe didn't have any, he remained trapped until this moment. Pretty cool, huh? Well, it's not. I just made that shit up. I have no fucking idea whatsoever why Katara waterbending in the vicinity of Aang breaks him out of his iceberg. In the cartoon, it's much more of an accident. Sokka is rude to Katara, and she kinda goes off on him, throwing her arms and emotions around and straight up accidentally chopping a huge chunk of the iceberg that submerges Aang. To clarify, Aang's iceberg is underneath this iceberg in the show. Because don't you think someone from the Fire Nation would have noticed a frozen airbender meditating in the middle of an iceberg? There's also some statues that Zuko has in his room that glow when Katara begins bending. More on that in one sec. In the cartoon, Katara busts open this iceberg that Aang is trapped in with a weapon that Sokka carries, not her bending. Only then does the iceberg emit a huge sky beam, and Zuko sees it with his own eyes in the cartoon. Meanwhile, in the show, he's writing in his diary and his little statue's eyes glow. That's actually a reference to episode 3, when Aang enters the Avatar state near the Air Temple Sanctuary, and all the other sanctuaries of the other nations are informed via glowing eyes that the Avatar has returned. Zuko speaks the same word in both mediums, actually. Finally! He's the first character this has happened with, and we've already met Aang, Katara, Sokka, and Zuko. Just thought I'd throw that out there. The cartoon takes this opportunity to establish both Zuko and Iroh, but the show wishes to save Iroh for later. As we all know, Zuko tracks the gang throughout Book 1 across the entire world, and he always seems to be nearby when large events give them away. It's almost as if Aang has a tracker locator tag on him. Maybe Sokka needs to be a little bit more careful when he's using public Wi-Fi to watch his isekai anime. You know that guy's a weeb, just look at him. If he had NordVPN, Zuko wouldn't know where to find them, and the world could have been saved a whole lot sooner. And what do you know? They are this video's sponsor. I know, it's exciting. Be like Toph, be smart. You know that girl has her personal information locked up tight. If you're looking for a way to keep your browsing safe and private, NordVPN has been great for protecting my data, especially when I'm on public Wi-Fi. Look, I'm a dad, and if I had to stay inside with a toddler all day, he would wear me to pieces. So when we're out in the world, at the library, at the play place, or wherever, and I need to work, I know that NordVPN has my back to keep me safe. Nobody's going to be breaking into my YouTube account anytime soon to spam you with ice-cold takes and mispronouncing names. Yeah, who'd do that? That's weird. Plus, NordVPN lets you access from different regions, which is a nice bonus. Like if you're from the Earth Kingdom, but there's a little spicy water tribe drama that's only visible from the North Pole. Maybe just pop your region over there and indulge. Just remember to set it back when you order food, or that orange fried lemur isn't gonna find you. So head on over to nordvpn.com/lambs to see how they can keep you safe. Thank you again to NordVPN for sponsoring this video. Pedantic time. In the show, Aang is always standing, but in the cartoon, he actually had to stand himself up. Sokka and Katara are blown on their backs in the show, but in the cartoon, they're standing upright and Sokka holds a weapon to Aang. Aang in the show falls onto the snow, but in the cartoon, Katara catches him. Everything else that happens after this is different, as Aang doesn't wake up in the show until he's back at the village, but in the cartoon, he wakes up a moment later in Katara's arms.
What part of that makes you think, great, let's bring him home.
I will say that Sokka remains the funniest character in both mediums. Oh, and this is my son, Corbin. His attitude, however, is different in the cartoon. Since the boat was destroyed, him and Katara are kind of relying on Appa to get them back to their homes. The next scene in the show is Aang resting, since he still hasn't been woken up from his ice nap yet. The first time we actually see Aang in the village in the cartoon is him asleep, so these line up fairly well. However, the villagers inspecting him is exclusive to the show. It serves as Grand's introduction, which the cartoon happens while he's awake a few minutes later. In the show, she notices his tattoos, but in the cartoon, it's Katara who notices them while Aang gets dressed. She also tells the kids that he's an airbender, which is unnecessary in the cartoon since he airbends in front of them as soon as he wakes up. Zuko telling Iroh that he needs to hunt the Avatar in the Water Tribe village is kinda sorta taken from immediately after the Avatar wakes up and emits the spirit light into the sky. In the show, it seems like he's asking Iroh for permission, I guess. But in the cartoon, he doesn't need to do this. He just tells the helmsman to plot a course. The show takes this opportunity to establish that Zuko is the banished prince from the Fire Nation, but that fact isn't revealed until episode 3, when he speaks to Zhao. This is also the first scene where Zuko explains that taking his place by his father's side is his destiny. I'll have more to say about this later. And next, Aang waking up. In both mediums, he's having a nightmare about the storm that he got frozen in, but in the show, he wakes up on his own, while in the cartoon, he's woken up by Katara. In the show, this is his first time being awake, but in the cartoon, it would be his second. His first time waking up in the cartoon, he's held by Katara and he asks her to go penguin sledding with him. In the show, the first person he talks to is actually Sokka, where he tells him his name is Aang. It's fascinating and interesting that the first two questions he asks in the show, where am I and how did I get here, are omitted from the cartoon. The next beat is Aang, flying again, to call out for Appa.
You know, last time I checked, humans can't fly.
In the cartoon, this is unnecessary since Appa goes with them. By the way, just gonna throw this image on screen. This is a staff, which doubles as a glider. This is how Aang flies in the cartoon. In the show, he calls for Appa on his whistle, but he doesn't receive the whistle in the cartoon until episode 9. When Appa does arrive in the show, he's seen flying, but in the cartoon, him flying is a reveal actually saved for later, because he's exhausted when he wakes up and can only float them back to their village. The scene where Gran is in the village questioning Aang is a show exclusive. The closest thing we get is his introduction in episode 1, but it's more so about establishing that Aang's glider allows him to fly, and Katara's hope returning because of him. Gran giving us what is now the third explanation of the Avatar is exclusive to the show. In the cartoon, she was knowledgeable about the air nomads, but that's kind of it, not so much about the Avatar itself. It's also fascinating that Gran would have called it the Great Comet, when at this point it would have been renamed Sozin's Comet.
He is the last airbender.
It's also kind of funny because this is her conclusion, but I could have sworn this whole conversation was about Aang being the Avatar. Now, to be fair, Aang does have his line of,
I really am the last airbender.
in the cartoon, but it's in episode 3 after he finally sees what remains of his civilization. The show elects to give this to Gran for the really good reason of because Zuko scolding his crew is exclusive to the show. The only time we see Zuko's crew have any kind of personality is in episode 12, when they speak to Iroh about how Zuko treats them. Also, they wear the traditional firebender uniforms in the cartoon, but they're missing their masks in the show. The next scene of Aang brooding about his time in the iceberg is taken from episode 1 again, when him and Katara uncover it together while they explore the Fire Navy ship. But then Katara explaining the state of her village to Aang is taken from episode 1 as well, but it's the opening narration, not ever directly explained to Aang. The cartoon really slow rolls the idea that the world is at war so that it can build up the characters instead. Like how it has Aang directly ignore Sokka when he tells him this because more on the pedantic side again, the Fire Navy ship can be seen from the main gates of the village in the show. These two notice it by accident, but in the cartoon, they have to travel well out of their way to see it. The cartoon has Katara explain that it's a very bad memory for her people, but in the show, she flat out tells Aang the news flash on the state of the world, between the Earth Kingdom and the North Pole. Good thing she gets news blasts on her iPhone here in the South Pole. Katara saying that no one visits other nations is exclusive to the show, and it's actually kind of a major plot point, so keep it in memory. The next scene of Zuko training is from episode 1, but he's training alone in the show and with other firebenders in the cartoon. Iroh offers him tea in this scene, but in the cartoon he offers him tea in the first scene of them, not the second. Iroh also criticizes Zuko in the cartoon, pushing him to be better, unlike the show where his skills apparently have never been sharper. Iroh tells Zuko in the show that Ozai believed finding the Avatar and defeating him would be impossible, but this is, and I cannot stress this enough, never spoken aloud in the cartoon. Next up is Aang and Katara returning to the Fire Navy ship. Katara tries to bend some water here and she can't do it, and then she tells Aang that all the other waterbenders were killed. Whoa, spoilers, we don't learn that information until book fucking 3 in the cartoon. Aang gives Katara a small bending lesson here, and she goes on to immediately bend water into a ball. I'll talk about this a little bit later. While she practices bending, she notices the Fire Navy closing in on the village. In the cartoon, they were specifically signaled by the destroyed Fire Navy ship sending up a flare when Aang and Katara set it off. The show just kinda has Zuko arrive there because, I guess it's the only village in the South Pole, I don't know. Sokka is already aware of the incoming attack, and is planning for it when she arrives back in both mediums. However, the defenses in the cartoon are actually played off as a joke, since we already established that Sokka is literally the only able-bodied warrior in the South Pole. The only thing he has to prepare for in the cartoon is himself, with some dope-ass face paint and armor. He tells the little kids to man the defenses, but when the time comes, it's literally just him facing down Zuko's ship. Fucking Chad over here. Also, Gran randomly spouts out that Aang is the avatar to Katara and Sokka. This reveal is done by Zuko when he invades their village, and Sokka is actually enthusiastic about saving him, rather than angry like he is in the show. In the show, they have the boat stationed like 200 feet away from the opening of the village, but in the cartoon the boat literally rams through the front, throwing Sokka down. There are wooden gates in the show, but a snow wall in the cartoon. Zuko dispatches Sokka in the cartoon without breaking a sweat, and then he talks to the village. But in the show, he talks to the village first. He doesn't introduce himself to the village in the cartoon either, he just immediately cuts to the chase and asks for the avatar. In the show, Sokka wants to give up the avatar, but in the cartoon, even after Zuko makes his intentions clear, Sokka doesn't negotiate with firebenders. Katara's tirade about Aang giving her hope is taken straight out of the Ember Island players.
It just gave me so much hope!
But, fun fact, it's actually Gran in the cartoon who says it to Katara that she's found her hope again. So Sokka's fight with Zuko. In the cartoon, we have two small encounters. First, he gets knocked off the bridge with no effort, and then he puts up a bit more of a fight, but is still taken down with ease. In the show, Sokka comes out and tells the Fire Nation to leave, challenges Zuko to a 1v1 in Rust, and then gets schooled. Only when Zuko is about to deliver a fatality to Sokka does Aang step in, and that's true in both mediums. Wolf Cove fighting back against the Firebenders is exclusive to the show, because, as mentioned, Sokka is the only warrior in the South Pole. Aang surrendering to Zuko is a beat in both mediums. He tells the two to take care of Appa for him in the cartoon, but in the show he tells Sokka that he's the bravest warrior he's ever met. Katara ranting to Sokka about how they have to save Aang is true in both mediums, as well as Sokka already being fully prepared to do it. Aang in a prison cell is exclusive to the show. In the cartoon, he is talked at on the deck of the ship, and breaks himself free of his capture before he ever reaches the brig. Iroh's conversation with Aang is exclusive to the show as well. In the cartoon, Iroh sees Aang on the deck and observes his escape, but the only words spoken between them is
Sorry.
when Aang opens the door to find him sleeping. It isn't until the Crossroads of Destiny in Book 2 when the two actually have a conversation together. So now, back to picking apart individual words. Aang asks Iroh why the Fire Nation started the war, and Iroh says number 1, it's within their nature to expand like fire itself, and 2, true stability from this world can only happen under their rule. Neither of these reasons are from the cartoon. The cartoon instead gives us 2 explanations, but they're very different. The first is from Fire Lord Sozin when he talks to Roku and tells him that the Fire Nation is at a time of unprecedented peace, and he wants to manifest destiny all over the world. While this may have been the actual intention in the beginning of the war, Phoenix King Ozai eventually continued it through a racist survival of the fittest perspective, as evidenced by his rantings to Avatar Aang.
You're weak, just like the rest of your people. They did not deserve to exist in this world, in my world.
The next scene is Sokka and Katara getting onto Appa to chase after the ship. It's at this point I ask, since we never had a scene to establish Appa flying, how do Katara and Sokka notice a yip yip to get him in the air? They had an entire scene dedicated to it in the cartoon, because, you know, knowing the rules of how to fly a sky bison were kind of important. The comedic timing of this moment in the show is good, but it also means we get to skip Gran's goodbye to them in the cartoon, making her last appearance in the show when she came out of nowhere and narked on the Avatar. Next up, Aang searching the ship for his staff. In the cartoon, he knew where to look because there was a joke about putting it in Zuko's quarters. In the show, he's just walking around, hoping he finds it. I don't know. Good thing he did though, because he finds Zuko's diary, which I'll remind you again did not exist in the cartoon. And upon finding his staff, he heads up to the deck and nopes out of there. In the cartoon, Zuko intercepts him in his quarters and the two have a small and impressive battle. It continues onto the deck, where Zuko hits Aang into the water, allowing him to go into the Avatar state and save himself, and use an incredible feat of waterbending to mess up his ship. From there, he nearly passes out on the ship as Katara and Sokka land to help him. The show handles this differently. As he gets to fly away, he gets shot down from Zuko while in the air. He gets grabbed midair by Sokka, and there's no Avatar state moment in the South Pole. Zuko then fires another fireball at them, and Appa, being unable to press the dodge button, gets saved by Katara, who bends up the ocean to intercept it. Yeah, we'll talk about it, don't worry. It should be noted that in the cartoon, Zuko does fire another fireball at them as they escape, but his firebending alone isn't enough, and he has to team up with Iroh to get a fireball with that amount of range. And then it's Aang who deflects it with an airbending baseball swing. Both mediums have a talk on Appa immediately after this, but in the show, they're kinda aimless as to their next stop. While in the cartoon, everyone's very clear on Aang's responsibility to learn all 4 elements, starting the journey to the North Pole, with Katara learning it with him as a bonus. Their next stop, where we spend the next 11 minutes, is the Southern Air Temple, which is the entirety of episode 3. It's also the single only episode in the cartoon that has a unique title page with the sun rising up over the words. Now, in the cartoon, the Air Temple is a pit stop on their way to the North Pole, since Aang needs to see the temple for himself and come to grips with what being away for 100 years has meant for his people. It's also his home, and he's excited to go back. I mention it because these motivations are completely missing from the show. The cartoon really slow rolls Aang's exploration of the temple, but in the show, Sokka picks up a Fire Nation helmet within the first minute of their arrival. Sokka does find a Firebender helmet in the cartoon, and Katara bends some snow on top of it to keep it a secret from Aang for as long as she can. The show has Aang immediately go into the destroyed parts of the temple, where he finds Gyatso just a moment later. The cartoon has Aang show us Gyatso for the first time in statue form before we ever see his corpse. And then when they do find his body, it's at the end of their time in the Air Temple after they detour to the Air Temple Sanctuary, where he sees all the past reincarnations of the Avatar cycle, an event that is entirely missing from the show. The gang eventually chase Momo, where he leads Aang to Gyatso's corpse. It's something he randomly stumbles upon, not seeks out. In the show, Katara and Sokka are both right behind Aang when he enters the Avatar state, but in the cartoon it's just Sokka, and Katara joins them shortly after. The show makes it the, memory of Gyatso, I guess, that calms Aang down from the Avatar state, while the cartoon has, what I consider at least, a much more emotional moment between Katara and Aang, where she proclaims that they're all a family now. Yes, Aang cries in the show and not in the cartoon, but I still hold by this opinion. The show has a conversation about what the Avatar state even is, but the cartoon skips past this since it's now the second time they've seen him this way. Aang uses the Airbender's death as motivation to be the Avatar in the show, while in the cartoon he did not require such motivation, as he planned on being the Avatar because it was the right thing to do. Aang's speech about accepting that he's the Avatar is kinda taken from the end of episode 2 when he talks to Katara and Sokka. It's also worth noting that in the cartoon, Team Avatar takes the pressure off of saving the world by breaking it down into more manageable steps, starting with mastering the elements. The show decides to keep it more aimless, I suppose, by having Aang's primary objective just be, you know, save the world.
Oh, is that all?
And lastly, Zuko's scribblings of Aang are exclusive to the show as well. Now, let's be open-eyed about this. The show is a retelling of the original cartoon, and I'm pretty sure they were accounting for everybody watching the show to have seen the original cartoon. Even then, I wonder when they were accounting for a previous watch. Did they expect people to watch the cartoon right before watching the show in anticipation? Or, what I think is more likely, they're trying to pull memories from people who watched the show when they were 8 years old 15 years ago. Hey, remember how Iroh was a wise presence? Throw that shit right in episode 1. Hey, remember how Katara's a waterbender? Yeah, you do. Hey, remember how Zuko had a truly fucked up thing happen to him? Well, if you don't, now you do. These events were things that were built up over the entire show, not thrown into the pilot. Katara had to waterbend backwards because she didn't know how to control her powers yet. Iroh was still hurling fire at Aang. Zuko wasn't redeemable yet, but the show wants you to remember how cool the original cartoon was, and transplant those feelings onto the show without actually taking the time to develop them. This episode is rushing the entire story of Avatar in the first episode, and it doesn't ever really slow down. To add some flair to my analysis, I'm going to add a lesson or an overarching theme to each episode we just witnessed, and the theme I'm giving episode 1 is patience. Rush to the good parts, show me things I remember, don't even think about saving any reveals or character development for something we can do over the whole show. Put that shit all in episode 1. Me and my researchers tried to find an actual answer to this, but the best I got was that the creators of the Netflix show wanted to appeal to both new and old fans of the franchise. What that means for the writing is up to your own interpretation. But let's talk about some specifics. Firstly, and least significantly, the comet is super far away. In the cartoon, the only time we get to see the comet in action is during the finale, and that shit was pushing clouds out of the sky. It was super low to the ground. Now, maybe 100 years can change its trajectory where it gets lower, but the show makes it seem like it's nowhere near the atmosphere. For the opening, few questions right off the bat. When did the Fire Nation's racism really start? Because I find it amazing that an Earthbender could make it to the Fire Nation capital to begin with. Although these guys seem surprised, so maybe he was hiding his earthbending pretty well. Still an interesting question to ask. Definitely not in the cartoon though, so why is it here? Well, firstly, I point to a meta reason. The first feat of earthbending we see in the cartoon was in episode 5, and it wasn't against a firebender. It's an exciting point to throw the show into, especially since the last feat of live-action earthbending we saw was... But in universe, I think the showrunners wanted to show the extinction of the air nomads on screen, if only because it's an element of the cartoon that was never really shown. I point to Star Wars again. Sorry, not sorry. Remember how Order 66 was kind of tastefully done originally? Suddenly, in a blip, the Jedi were wiped out. But then we started seeing it more, and more, and more, and fuck me, do we really need to see it again? The moral of the story is that I think some things are better left to imagination. I think this falls into that category. Did we really need to see Gyatso die? Wasn't his skeleton enough? But, similar to Order 66, I think the showrunners thought that this was a cool moment in Avatar history, and it is, by the way, and wanted to show it off more. Now, I want to bring your attention to something that I'm going to talk about a few times in this episode specifically. They repeat themselves a lot, especially with Gyatso talking about the Avatar state, reincarnation, and things that were literally just explained to us. Let's contrast quick. The scene where Aang is told he's the Avatar in the show. Aang is taken to a sacred part of the temple. Gyatso goes over the Avatar's past, the reincarnation cycle, and the state of the world. The whole talk is 3 minutes. In the cartoon, Aang is asked to speak with the Masters, and the scene opens with,
How do you know it's me?
completely skipping the explanation of the reincarnation cycle. This is something the film world likes to call cutting to the fucking chase. After Aang asks this question, they explain their methods and why they told him early, due to the troubling signs that war is coming. The entire scene takes, wait for it, 1 fucking minute. 1 minute to clear up some honestly very real questions, not to dilly-dally, not repeating the same information that the audience already has. Runtime is a finite thing, and the cartoon did not waste time over-explaining things. It just didn't have the time. Which I think actually lent itself to the mystery of the Avatar as well. Consider this. The show makes makes it super clear, multiple times even, what the Avatar is, the reincarnation cycle, that it's Aang, and his feelings about it. The cartoon, on the other hand, developed this goofy kid who accidentally has these massive power spikes at times due to being the Avatar, and gave us one line about his feelings.
I never wanted to be.
That was all in the pilot. The Avatar state isn't even fully explained until Avatar Roku explains it to him in the end of episode 1 of book 2. Talk about the mystery of the Avatar, we had to wait an entire season just to understand why Aang glows sometimes. The reincarnation cycle is explained as a dedicated scene one time in episode 3. They slow rolled the hell out of what the Avatar was. No one knew what it was when it was airing. I believe the culprit of these changes exists in the idea I posed earlier. When was the audience supposed to have last seen Avatar? I think they may have felt that everybody was already familiar with the concept of the Avatar, so why keep it a mystery? But I can easily clap back against that and say that if everybody is already familiar with the reincarnation cycle, why the hell do we have to hear it 4 times? Well, let's take a moment and talk about viewer retention. You, yes you, right now at this very second, are most likely not watching the screen. You missed the hot bikini picture I threw up on the screen a moment ago. Don't worry, I'm not offended, but it is a consistent problem that the film industry is facing right now. And Netflix has responded to this problem with a term I despise to my very core: second screen content. There are multiple reports, and I have multiple sources for Netflix executives telling writers that their story isn't second screen enough, or is too visually heavy and difficult for people to follow who are not actually watching the screen. That's just the landscape now, so how do you respond to an audience that won't actually watch your content? Well, you over-explain. You announce when a character enters the room. You go over content that has visuals a few different times to make sure people can really absorb it, like the Avatar cycle. My personal take on this is that professional content like film and TV are pay-attention media.
You're goddamn right.
I often put my phone down or away when I watch a new movie or show because I really want to take it in the way the filmmakers intended. Meanwhile, I view Twitch and most YouTube content as second screen content. Not all content, because there's some people who put in extremely high quality content and you should pay attention to every detail. But there's a specific pacing that goes into movies and TV shows that if you're not paying full attention, you can really miss something. Which means I also actually review reality TV content as second screen content, because the narrative is far easier to follow and not quite as dense as something like the Avatar story. But I digress. It's a real problem in the industry, and Netflix has responded by over-explaining. This concept of making stories easier to understand rears its ugly head in a lot of ways for this story, and you bet your ass I'll be talking about it as it comes up. Because the problem with over-explaining for a second screen audience is that a primary screen audience will get bored and straight up have their time wasted by having the same information drilled into them over and over again. For instance, Aang spells out his feelings to Appa, but this kind of monologuing isn't anywhere in the cartoon. Instead, he actually is allowed to express his feelings naturally as they come up, not dump them all at once. And you bet your ass this was because the emotion on Aang's face when he was told he was the Avatar is a visual cue, and the writers didn't want you kids scrolling on your phone with this on in the background and miss out on it. Aang also does a really good job of telling us things about himself, like how he plays airball and eats banana cakes, as opposed to, you know, actually doing those things, like he does for the cartoon. Aang says he's a goofy kid in the show. He shows us he's a goofy kid in the cartoon. This idea of tell don't show plagues the show from start to end, so remember that as it comes up in the future. Now back to the genocide. Using fire fists to fly actually answers a world building question that no one but me was asking. If the air nomads were in an area inaccessible to the other nations, how did the Fire Nation get them at all? We see them using climbing tanks to attack the Northern Air Temple in Book 1, and they have airships by the end of the 100-Year War, but this technology didn't exist 100 years ago. Remember before when I said insinuation is the friend of imagination? By showing us exactly how the Firebenders did it, you don't get to ask the question, did the air nomads put up a fight? You didn't get to ask, did the Fire Nation use fucking dragons to kill the air nomads because they were only in air power positions? Or did the Fire Nation soldiers literally scale the temple with ropes and ladders and get serious pushback from the nomads? Maybe they captured Sky Bison. I can think of a million dope ways that the Fire Nation could have attacked the temples, but we actually get our answer in the form of these fire fists, and I think that's the most boring. But maybe that's just me. I don't know. Maybe I thought, you know, capturing bison or using dragons was a cooler thing than this. Continuing on about the genocide, was the fact that the Firebenders get their power from the comet supposed to be a reveal? In the cartoon, it was a reveal that the comet would give them their power toward the end of the summer.
But not when we have the power of the comet.
It just kind of seems stapled on here in the show, especially because we have no frame of reference for how powerful the Fire Nation is. The only frame of reference I can personally draw is the power that the comet gives them in the cartoon, and in comparison, these guys aren't even juiced at all. Probably another change for the, oh, people remember this kind of crowd. Now we're going to talk about a really hard topic actually, character introductions. Query for you, viewer. How do you introduce a character who is an airbending master? Let's talk about something called first pool of thought. Usually the first pool of thought you have is very shallow and surface level. It's what comes to your mind first. He's an airbending master. He's obviously going to be airbending. airbending. Let's look at the second pool of thought. It's a little bit deeper. A king doesn't need to say he's a king, and mastering an element would probably mean he uses it so casually he doesn't even think about it. So how about instead of making the bending the focus, you instead focus on the character, and you have your character airbend so naturally that it's not even addressed by them. I've described what the show did, followed by what the cartoon did. The first bit of airbending Aang does in the cartoon is him using his airbending to stand up from a laying position. And the first thing he says to Katara is,
Will you go penguin sledding with me?
The fuck?
it shows that bending is so second nature it needs no explanation or excuse, and that he's a goofy kid. The first line of dialogue in the show was,
What? I was just enjoying the bit.
what does that tell you about the character? Character introductions are hard, really hard sometimes, but it's no contest which scene, cartoon or show, does more to tell us who Aang is and what being a master means. Not to mention the amount of time spent. We get such a tremendous amount of character depth in the cartoon, and comparatively, it's a third of the length. I also need to bring up that attached to Aang is Appa, who just straight up does not get a character introduction in the show. In the cartoon, he gets introduced to Sokka and Katara by Aang himself, and then he sneezes on them. But in the show, he just rides him with no explanation of how Yip Yip gets him to fly. That was a whole big thing for the cartoon, remembering how to pilot the bison without Aang being present. Why do this? Again, it's that weird cocktail mix of, well, people already know Avatar, so we don't need to explain everything. But like any ruined cocktail, they added too much of one element, assumption. They aren't under-explaining, they're just straight up not explaining. Continuing, Katara's introduction is physically the same in both mediums, but the surrounding elements are different. Two patches of grass are not equal just because they're grass. In the show, she's practicing in secret by herself, but in the cartoon, she's with Sokka on the boat. This allows us to also fold in Sokka's introduction as well, as the two are joined at the hip in the cartoon. The beginning of their scene is Sokka saying,
Watch and learn, Katara. This is how you catch a fish.
followed by him failing to catch a fish that Katara did catch with her limited bending ability. Sokka scolds her for practicing as it's inconvenient to him. The show instead has Katara catch up to Sokka, who's acting as an actual leader for Wolf Cove, handling schedules, saying things like,
Just proves if you want something done right, you gotta do it yourself.
the cartoon always handled Sokka's leadership for what it was, a 13-year-old kid trying to be responsible. 13-year-olds most definitely have what it takes to be responsible, but by and large they're akin to pretending, doing what seems right. Like how he builds a watchtower out of snow, or can't see that his men of the water tribe are like 6. These things allow us to look at him and go, oh right, he's arrogant, but he's a kid and he's trying his best. The show doesn't actually have any counter to the statement, he's a leader. He seems to know what he's doing, and that makes Katara kind of a hard ass for teasing him about it. Hear me on this. The single only reason you would believe that Sokka isn't a leader if you watch the show is your meta-knowledge of the cartoon. Or if you do remember him as a leader, it's because he grew into one throughout the show. Book 3 has him literally leading armies and assaults, but in Book 1, what this season is adapting, dude was getting jealous of Jet's merry band of delinquents. Zuko's introduction, besides sharing the first spoken word, is different as well. The show kind of makes this encounter shorter, but the cartoon actually dedicates time to showing off the characters of Zuko and Iroh. Iroh is particularly laid back and peaceful. Zuko is a hothead and needs to capture the Avatar. This was missed from his introduction in the show. So what does all this mean? The scene in the cartoon establishes multiple things, while in the show, it really seems to almost pigeonhole them into one aspect of their personality. Katara's waterbending, Sokka's leadership, Aang's airbending. The solid principle for writing is that each scene should establish multiple things. A little bit of character, a little bit of plot, but they should never be as one note as the Netflix variant is making them. Finally, moving on from the introductions, Katara and Sokka discovering Aang. In the cartoon, our characters, not just Sokka and Katara, seem to have much more agency over their choices and decisions. Katara discovers Aang on accident because she got emotional from her brother's behavior, but the choice to free him from the iceberg was one she made intentionally, because she is someone who always cares for people.
I will never, ever turn my back on people who need me.
Meanwhile, in the show, things just kind of happen to our characters. There isn't even an acknowledgement from Katara or Sokka that she did that to the iceberg. In the cartoon, there is.
You mean I did that?
This is a problem that plagues the entire run of the Netflix show, and I reinforce it with another example. Katara isn't the one who notices Aang's tattoos, and I don't exactly know why the show is allergic to making our main characters observant and uncovering the world for themselves. The show exposits all over the damn place, which also makes it seem like the show just doesn't want to put in the work to show us things. Take this question. How do Katara and Sokka find out that Aang is an airbender? The cartoon answers this by having the airbending master just casually bend in front of them. The show answers this by having Gran tell them, before he even wakes up.
Another one.
How do we introduce to the audience that Zuko is banished? The cartoon's answer is to make this a taunt from a rival firebender, showing a deeper level of complexity to the Fire Nation leadership. The show's answer is to have two people who know it more than anyone, Iroh and Zuko, talk about it in their quarters. It just feels lazy. Here's a last one for you, and this one's a bit tricky. How do we show that Katara and Sokka have been hardened by the war? The cartoon answers this in a really subtle way. While Aang and Katara are penguin sledding, they say,
I haven't done this since I was a kid.
You still are a kid.
it tells the audience how she sees herself. How does the show answer this?
Guess he had to grow up fast.
It feels like not as much care went into these encounters compared to the cartoon. The Netflix version is very content with telling us these things, not showing us these things. Another example unfortunately exists in the conversation between Iroh and Zuko. Iroh flat out says,
A mission your father believed to be impossible
Okay, this idea is never said aloud in the cartoon. It's not a secret, but it's never said out loud. It exists in the subtext. Look at the surroundings. The Avatar had not been seen or heard from in 100 years. Ozai gave up his hunt after Fire Lord Azulan and Fire Lord Sozin failed to find him. But Ozai gave it to Zuko as a way to keep him chasing after a target he could never reach. It's not something that needs to be said. If you analyze the room a little, you can find it for yourself. But apparently not in the show. For some reason, they feel the need to spell out really clearly to the audience, and this isn't the only example. When telling Aang she's the only waterbender left in her village, Katara flat out says,
"They've killed all the others."
In the cartoon, firebenders seen on screen outnumber the other nations 3-1, so it's left up to the audience to wonder, wait, why is she the only one? And conclude that something bad must have happened here. The show just refuses to let us come to our own conclusions. Once Aang wakes up, the first person he talks to is Sokka in the show, not Katara. The show is going for a less romantic angle for Katara and Aang, but I still feel like this is just robotic. Take the romance out of it. It's intimate for a friend to be held by a friend, to wake up in a friend's arms after an injury or a battle, and the show just misses this beat because why? The show overall is aiming to make Aang less reliant on his friends. So much of the season is Aang doing things separate from Katara and Sokka. Do you know how many times that happened in the cartoon? Like 3 times in the entire season. They didn't stick together because they were Team Avatar. They were Team Avatar because they stuck together. Next thing I need to talk about is Katara's waterbending lesson from Aang. First pool of thought, right? Wow, she was told to focus and ended up progressing her bending. Lazy. Second pool of thought, right? If she's literally never been told to focus before, even if it seems like brain dead advice, hearing it from anybody probably would have helped her. And there's definitely a psychological element of being talked to by somebody who has mastered their craft. So it seems a little lazy, but I actually feel like I'm okay with Aang giving her some pointers on bending in general. I'm sure she won't have a massive power spike that makes literally no sense 15 minutes later. The Fire Nation closes in on the village, and Grand reiterates that Aang is the Avatar again. It seems like they just needed to make it crystal clear so nobody is confused, as if the audience could ever forget that the guy with a fucking arrow in his head is special. Sokka is also super mad that the Avatar disappeared, which is unique to the show. Katara and Sokka knew the legends, but they didn't have much of an opinion on the world at large, because their lives have been affected by the Fire Nation, less so by the absence of the Avatar. When Zuko arrives at the village, Sokka tries to give Aang up, but in the cartoon, he fights the Fire Nation just out of pure hatred for them. It doesn't matter if they wanted a cup of snow, he would send them away. Now, I've got some negative things to say about the show, but let's make it clear. The encounter with Sokka is actually the first instance of the show trying to present a new element. In the cartoon, it was pretty clear and cut. Sokka wouldn't even talk to the Fire Nation. But in the show, Wolf Cove would do anything to survive, and if the Fire Nation was asking for an outsider, Sokka would sell him out to keep their people safe. So finally, let's add a new folder to this analysis. Let's make the new ideas folder and put this one inside of it. Submission and compromise. Katara talks him out of it anyway, and next up we have to talk about Sokka's fight with Zuko. I need to break down the fight into smaller parts so I can illustrate a point at the end, so bear with me here. In the show, Zuko is taunted and engages with Sokka in a 1v1, wiping the floor with him, so Sokka runs away from him and Zuko knocks him down. Aang pushes him down, saving Sokka, and then the unit gets pelted by rocks. Zuko orders his people to burn the village to the ground, encouraging Aang to surrender. The cartoon plays this out differently. Zuko's boat rams the wall of Wolf Cove, where Sokka alone is standing on it, ready to engage the enemy. The ramp lowers and Sokka runs up to try to hit Zuko, but he kicks him off it effortlessly, addressing the village. He low-key threatens Gran, asking the village to give up Aang. Sokka returns to the fight, throwing his boomerang at Zuko, then engaging him with a spear, the only assist from the village. Zuko makes quick work of Sokka for a second time, but then when he's down, Boomerang comes back and hits him in the head from behind. Zuko gets furious, and only then does Aang approach by running Zuko over with his penguin sled. He surrounds Aang, and it's revealed to the village that he's the Avatar from Zuko.
You're just a child.
Well, you're just a teenager.
And without further dialogue, Zuko firebends at Aang. He deflects it, but realizes the village is in collateral damage range, so he surrenders. So let's tally up. What did we learn? From the show, we learned that Zuko is a formidable fighter, easy to bait, and quick to anger. Sokka is the leader of the people, brave, but sucks at fighting. The village isn't as defenseless as we thought, and we saw that Aang is an airbender. These elements are things we already established in earlier scenes. Now the cartoon. We learned that Zuko means business, is an expert fighter, but he isn't untouchable, as he's still an angry teenager. We learned that the Fire Nation so far can't be beat, and that they're way more industrialized than the primitive water tribe. We learned that Aang is the Avatar, but firstly he's a goofy kid. We saw that the village was in danger, and that Aang wasn't about to let it be collateral. These elements are things we already established in earlier scenes. With this direct comparison, I hope I can more easily illustrate that the show just straight up isn't written with the same level of intention as the cartoon. The cartoon made the most out of literally every line of dialogue. Every detail of the cartoon was intentional. There will be dozens more as we progress, but here's one. When Aang gets snow on Zuko, Zuko's natural body heat is so hot from being a firebender that he just burns it off without thinking. Things like this that make the world feel alive and just, right for the world. Here's another quick example. In the show, at the the end of the episode, Zuko uses some kind of stamp that he puts to a candle to stamp his Aang drawing. Wouldn't it have been cooler if he just like pressed his thumb on the page and signed it that way? Show that he can stamp things with his own powers? Or a few episodes later, when Katara is practicing her waterbending in a creek, she splashes Aang, so Aang goes over to the creek and splashes her back, and Katara engages with him by using her hands? What are you, me? You're a waterbender! Another thing, there's like no humor in the show. This unfortunately was a deliberate choice, where the Netflix adaptation was attempting to make the show more adult and less for kids, which I guess means less funny. By and large, the cartoon was pretty funny, and it's not like they toned down their horrific moments for it. The Airbender genocide did happen, the waterbenders were imprisoned, Azula did kill Aang, and yet we can still laugh at Aang making up a funny name to get into OMASHU, or Iroh lamenting about if this flower will make tea. Speaking of Iroh, let's talk about his conversation with Aang in prison. Remember before how this episode is lacking patience? Iroh from the Netflix show is basically season 2 Iroh the entire time. Now yes, there were hints of his sensitive nature as early as episode 7 when he sees Roku's dragon in spirit form, and when he explains to the crew how Zuko was scarred from his father in episode 12, culminating in him choosing the balance of the world over the domination of the Fire Nation in the finale, episode 20. But you know which episode I didn't mention? Episode 1. It's simply another rushing of who he is as a character. We're dealing with season 2 Iroh in the first episode, and he's not there yet, or he shouldn't be. Aang escapes by airbending the keys from a guard into his hand. I was kind of ignoring it up until now, but I can't put it off anymore. We need to talk about how characters bend in the cartoon. You may have heard this before, so I'll try to be brief. There was a lot of real-life martial arts techniques that went into every frame of bending for Avatar, and it was an extremely long process where they would hire one fucking king of martial arts, have him perform the first round of motions for the script, the animation team would replicate them, then send them back so that he could confirm they looked right. And this was done for every martial arts fight and bend that happens in the cartoon. Bending comes from stance for starters. It was extremely rare to see feats of bending in the cartoon without the appropriate stance and follow-through motions. The team specifically said,
It should come from somewhere to go to somewhere.
a wind-up and a letdown. Choreography takes way more time to pull off than you think, dear viewer. So why am I bringing this up? Because take a look at this escape from the cartoon, and lay it next to the escape from the show. Firstly, less action, but we'll let that slide, who cares? More importantly, look at the body motions. In the cartoon, there was, as far as I can remember, 4 instances of airbending using wrist motion and nothing else. It was extremely uncommon and didn't really play much into the main story at all. The way Aang moves in the show, is this the Force?
That's not how the Force works.
I could throw the Force theme over this part and it would look right at home. Or when he's flying around looking for Appa.
Oh, they fly now!
Here's him gliding in the cartoon. And for giggles, here's him attempting to glide without being able to airbend. And here's him without his glider, just flying. It's no secret that there was a shit ton of work going into the original Avatar series to help the bending feel grounded. The animation had specific types of martial arts assigned to each bending ability to allow it to feel different and stand out. My research turned up that each of the actors received a boot camp, but the specific level of care and triple checking simply wasn't there for the live action. The fact that the martial arts look stale in the show is actually one of the biggest complaints out there, so I wanted to make sure I addressed it here. Maybe this was just cutting corners, I wouldn't rule out Netflix just being lazy, but maybe it was a limitation of the media to begin with. For now, we'll just leave it at that, because the show does plenty of lazy things in the future that I don't need to pin this specifically on being lazy as well. Next, Zuko's diary. Remember how I said the show actually tries to add a few new unique ideas to the series? This is our second, and it's actually super good. I am perplexed in retrospect that Zuko didn't have a diary like this in the cartoon. It makes total sense. With the stakes that are put on him for capturing the Avatar, why not devote your existence to deeply trying to understand the Avatar cycle and all that? Speaking of the Avatar cycle, let's talk about his escape. Here's a fun trivia question. Which 2 instances of Aang using the Avatar state in the cartoon were the closest together? The answer is episode 2 and episode 3 of book 1, when he uses it to waterbend Zuko's ship and when he finds Gyatso's body. First pool of thought, this sounds excessive. Why have him do it twice so soon? Second pool of thought, what were the circumstances surrounding him entering the Avatar state? The first time, his life was in danger, which also explains why he survived the storm that him and Appa got caught in 100 years ago. The second time, he underwent severe emotional distress, a loss that literally no one in the world can understand. Now, dear viewer, let me ask you, if you decided to agree with the first pool of thought, which of these instances do you think is more important to keep? And I think that logic exactly is why it's different. They didn't think deeper on why he did it twice so soon. They just figured they could probably get away with only one. Follow-up question then. If Aang can't Avatar state his way out of his fight with Zuko, how do we conclude the fight in a satisfying way? First way is to just have Aang escape, maybe with the help of his friends like he did in the show. I honestly think I would have rather gone this route, because option 2 would be to have Katara save them. In isolation, not a bad suggestion, not like she hasn't saved the team dozens of times in the cartoon. Problem is, again, was that this is episode 1. So now, let's detour away and talk again about Katara's power levels. I know, there's so many damn subsections in this first part. Let's compare 1 to 1. The first time Katara waterbends in the show, she can't make a bubble. The first time in the cartoon, she catches a fish in a floating bubble. This establishes our baseline for these characters. The second use of bending in the show is her showing great control over the ocean, dragging a boat back to her and Sokka on the iceberg. Before we even go into the cartoon, where do you rank this exactly? I would consider this a great deal more controlled than her failing to make a bubble than before, especially because it's successful. It's not like she tries to waterbend the boat and fails. So with no further training from bend 1 to bend 2, I'd say she improves significantly. Her second bend is accidentally breaking the iceberg on top of Aang with her emotions. Not a trick question. Where do you rank this as far as power level goes? I would consider it stronger than making a bubble, but it was an accident. And she wasn't channeling any bending ability into it at all, just her emotions. Put a pin in that, we'll talk about emotion bending in a bit. I'd consider this stronger, but almost with an asterisk. She also can't replicate it, since it came from her emotions. So while it is such an important moment in the show, I wouldn't consider it factoring into her power levels at all in the cartoon. Now the third time she bends in the show, she's trying to show Aang that she can bend water, and again, she cannot make a bubble. Basically a wash, so let's just keep that power level the same. Third bend for the cartoon, she accidentally water whips towards Sokka, while attempting to attack some Fire Nation soldiers. Similar to having her power on accident, I'm not feeling like she's getting much stronger here. Maybe like a +1 for points, you know? She's a desperate kid in the moment, and Sokka accidentally pays the price. Fourth bend in the show follows her third bend. Immediately after Aang tells her to focus her mind, she bends a bubble with what looks like a great amount of control. Let's jump her power level up, and honestly, sure, she deserves it. All good so far. Fourth bend in the cartoon follows her third bend, where she now turns her back towards the enemy so that she can do the familiar waterbending form, except onto her attackers. I'm gonna raise her power level here if only because she has a greater understanding of her bending ability and her own positioning. Baby steps, but seriously, as far as power goes, she has to bend backwards because she doesn't know what she's doing. Now, fifth bend. Let's actually start with the cartoon. It doesn't happen in episode 2, but in episode 3, when she bends some snow onto a Fire Nation helmet to hide it from Aang. It should be noted that now she can bend water that's in front of her, even if not with precision. A subtle move in the right direction for her. It's also the only bend she does in the entire episode. Fifth bend for the show. Zuko fires a fireball at Appa, and she bends the ocean up to intercept it. The ocean? Bro, how high up are you right now? Let's be generous and say it's 300 feet. You were having trouble bending a water bubble that was literally right in front of you less than 20 minutes ago. I was very willing to give her a pass when Aang gave her some pointers, but this is ridiculous. If there was already water on Appa somehow, I could see that. I wouldn't have a problem with it. But do you realize it's not until episode 10 in the cartoon when she bends water she can't see for the first time? And she needs another pep talk to make it happen. Bending water you can't see is a huge step for her. She like quadrupled her power levels in one move, and she has the gall to look at her hands like, oh, did I do that? Yes, you did! I'm just as amazed as you are! We'll keep an eye on Katara's progress towards being a bender, but we're one episode in and I can feel right away that it's not going to feel earned at all when she fights Pakku in the North Pole. To quickly say, Aang's power levels are almost inconsequential because he already is an airbending master and he doesn't bend water in season 1. A ridiculous notion, I assure you. I know you're all laughing out of your seats right now, as I was upon hearing this information. And Zuko also doesn't really need to continue building his power levels in the show since Iroh already told him he's great. This is different for the cartoon actually. Zuko's third scene is him telling Iroh to teach him the advanced set, and in the third episode, his Agni Kai with Zhao is him falling back on his firebending basics. It's masterfully done as far as reminding the audience that Zuko is a formidable fighter, but he's still just a teenager. The ride on Appa is super short compared to the cartoon. In the cartoon, they've already made the choice to leave home, and upon really coming face to face with Avatar Aang, they realize that they need to help him master the elements to defeat the Fire Nation, with their first step being the North Pole, so him and Katara can learn waterbending together. The show instead uses this as a bridge to the Southern Air Temple. So why? I feel like somewhere in the writing process, someone said, wait, why does Aang go back to the Southern Air Temple? And the one intern who actually saw the cartoon screamed, because he was returning home after being away. It's an important step for his character aside from being a goofy kid. But they couldn't really hear him because he was locked in a closet. In episode 3, titled The Southern Air Temple, you get this answer yourself. He's taking responsibility for being away. So back to the show. After his avatar state fit, he cites mastering all 4 elements as fulfilling some kind of last wish that the air nomads had for him. This massively changes his motivation from the cartoon. He still has this motivation, but he does it because the world is in turmoil, and he takes his duties as Avatar seriously, even if he doesn't want to at first. That's not to say he won't or doesn't take his Avatar responsibilities seriously in the show, but I mean, come on, it feels different, because it is different. Now, let's talk about Aang's Avatar state encounter. Aang enters the Avatar state upon seeing Gyatso's body, and his memories of Gyatso help calm him down. This is changed from Katara being the one who calms him down in the cartoon, so why change this? My first answer, and it's rather snarky, is that the showrunners hate camaraderie and relationship building. Like, why aren't they building a stronger connection between our protagonists? My less snarky, more researched answer is that they're specifically trying to forego a romantic subplot between Katara and Aang. Thought 1. Why? It was a beautiful and actually super real part of the cartoon.
I'm just a little confused. I just said I was confused.
Thought 2. Even if you don't want them together romantically, it's still an intimate part of the journey for them. Even for Sokka, the dude is insanely kind and sweet to Aang when he turns back to normal.
Katara and I aren't gonna let anything happen to you. Promise.
I don't know if they're just doing that cutting corners thing I mentioned.
Well, that's a corner-cutting machine. We obviously cut them there.
Where like, well, the audience already feels they're close. They saw the cartoon, so we don't need to actually put any work into it. I've seen some theories online that the age gap is more noticeable in live action than it is in the cartoon. So it would be a little strange to see that relationship blossom. And that may be true, but I don't know, man. They have shows where young actors have crushes on other characters. It's not that weird if you do it tastefully. All right, enough yapping. Actual analysis time. Making Aang calm himself down with Gyatso's memory rather than Katara's words in the present makes Aang more of a lone wolf in this world. He's someone who can solve his own problems. Gyatso didn't calm Aang down. Aang calmed Aang down. Both of which are very different to how the cartoon handled it. This is an idea that remains constant throughout the show. Not establishing that Katara and Sokka are his family will rob us of gorgeous moments like this in the future. I swear, I actually kind of get misty-eyed when I think of this scene. So moving forward in the future, if we do have emotional scenes with Katara and Aang, they'll be even more rushed since we didn't establish it here. And that's the end of the analysis for episode 1. Netflix's Avatar: The Last Airbender covered episodes 1, 2, and some of 3 from book 1. It also included tidbits from 6, 7, and 12. It also had references and small notes from episodes 19 and 20 of book 2, and episodes 6 and 8 of book 3. It also introduced 2 new concepts, Submission and Compromise of the Southern Water Tribe and Zuko's Diary. But if the show is going to follow the cartoon, it places our story at episode 3. Hopefully that was all easy to follow. Now, our next step, riding the elephant koi. I mean, that is the reason we're going to Kyoshi Island in the show, right? Right? We open on Zuko's ship. No diary in the cartoon means no equivalent scene. And Iroh talking Zuko down could be taken from any number of scenes in the cartoon, but it's most likely the one right before the Kyoshi Island episode, episode 4, because their conversation ends with Iroh pointing out that there can't be that many places for him to hide, and a view of a map. The same map that Aang has in this episode. Zuko's sentiment about the ultimate warrior running away isn't found in the cartoon either. He's surprised that the Avatar is so young and inexperienced, but he's just rolling with it. Now, in the show, Aang wants to visit Kyoshi Island because of Avatar Kyoshi, but in the cartoon, his desire to visit is based around being a goofy kid who wants to ride the elephant koi. The exposition Aang gives about Kyoshi doesn't come until later in that episode, but they don't explain that she's a fierce warrior, just that she was an avatar and she's been dead for centuries. The gang actually doesn't learn that the island with the elephant koi is named Kyoshi Island until they're captured and told. Sokka's conversation with Katara about returning home is unique to the show, since they actually made a conscious decision to learn waterbending together in the cartoon. Momo's introduction is very different in the cartoon. Found in episode 3 again while the gang is visiting the Avatar Shrine. They think firebenders get the drop on them, but it's just this winged lemur. Sokka tries to eat him, Aang tries to befriend him, and the two give chase, leading to Monk Gyatso's corpse. Now, this is neat. Momo exiting Katara's bag reveals that Gran stashed away a waterbending scroll. She obtains this waterbending scroll in episode 9 of the cartoon by trading with pirates. Well, more specifically, stealing from pirates. It's the first time she's actually able to focus on her bending practices and embrace being a fighter. The cartoon was much more focused on developing character rather than power, which is why this is found in episode 9 and not episode 2. Aang burying Monk Gyatso is a show exclusive, which also means that Aang doesn't get a chance to say goodbye in the cartoon. The cartoon handles the departure from the Southern Air Temple with more of an upbeat attitude, with Aang talking to Momo and Appa about them being the last of their culture. As they fly away, Momo just joins them, I guess. In the cartoon, this was because Aang consciously made the choice to make Momo his pet. He also gets named just randomly, I guess.
He looks like a Momo, doesn't he?
But more trivia time. Momo means peach in Japanese, and Aang names him that because he steals a peach out of Sokka's hands when they meet again. Zuko and Iroh visiting the port that houses the headquarters of the local Fire Nation commander is a show exclusive. Well, the reasoning is. In the cartoon, they do visit a repair dock, but it's to, well, repair the ship. Both mediums have a similar conversation about keeping the Avatar's presence under wraps. The cartoon uses this as an opportunity to introduce Captain Zhao.
It's Commander now.
This happens as the B-plot to the Southern Air Temple episode, actually, while the show makes it the B-plot to Kyoshi Island. Next up, Team Avatar's first stop is the Avatar Kyoshi statue, as that was their reason for coming in the first place. In the cartoon, their first stop is to ride the elephant koi, where they get ambushed and tied to the Kyoshi statue. Yeah, ambushed. The show makes it a struggle, but the cartoon never sees them coming. They even blindfold them. Aang only reveals that he's the Avatar to them because he finds out that the name of the island is Kyoshi, but in the show, Katara is throwing out that information to anybody and everybody, apparently. In the show, Suki says the secret slime action code phrase, and the statue lights up and shines its light down on Aang. This spectacle is excluded from the cartoon. Next is the town hall meeting thing. First, the magistrate in the show is a woman, but in the cartoon, it's this old man. Secondly, the town hall is not in the cartoon, but it's kind of remixed from when they get tied to the Avatar statue. A lot of the information is the same, like how Kyoshi stayed out of the war. What's different is the support of the entire island. The entire island and magistrate in general are very welcoming of Aang once they discover he's the Avatar, but in the show they don't believe him. After this, Team Avatar decided to stay on Kyoshi so Appa can get cleaned and the team can get fed, but Katara cites the most important reason being that Aang is finally excited about being the Avatar, and she wants to nurture this. This didn't make it to the show, as Aang really got over his I never wanted to be the Avatar gloom really quickly. The magistrate being the parent of Suki is new to the show, as is Aang's plea to learn more about Kyoshi for his Avatar journey. Again, just to make it super clear, they didn't even know this was Kyoshi Island until they got there. And the time limit that they place on Team Avatar in the show isn't in the cartoon either. Sokka's first conversation with Suki, after the ambush I mean, is walking away from the town hall in the show, but in their dojo in the cartoon. Sokka brags about being the best warrior in his village in both mediums, but in the cartoon she humiliates him for being sexist and arrogant physically, while in the show she humiliates him for being arrogant verbally. Next is Zuko demanding reports and logs from Zhao's men. There isn't a scene like this, but if we return to episode 3 and observe their first interaction together, it's quite different. For starters, they are familiar with who Commander Zhao is in the cartoon, but in the show, it's their first time meeting. In the show, they ask for the reports with the excuse of hunting shark squids, but in the cartoon, they're repairing their ship. Zhao, quick thinking, interrogates the crew and uncovers extremely quickly that Zuko had the Avatar in custody but let him escape. Their relationship is one-sided honor and respect in the show, but it's straight up antagonistic in the cartoon, with Zuko being interrogated like a prisoner and the two of them dueling in an Agni Kai at the end. This was excluded from the show, but I definitely wanted to mention it. Next is Sokka washing up and Suki peeping on him. This is not in the cartoon. I wouldn't even say she was attracted to him until the end of their meeting anyway. And now, Katara practicing waterbending in the water. Actually a pretty good reference here. This water wave she's trying to create is found in episode 9, but it's not in the scroll. It's actually one of the first moves that Katara teaches Aang. However, she has trouble forming it and gets frustrated, giving up in that same episode. It does seem like her time practicing pays off, as she's now able to form a ball of water and throw it against a tree. Aang comes up and joins her when she's done with her forms, but in the cartoon, at this time with the scroll, he's always been present because, and let me get closer to the camera to make this clear, he was learning waterbending with her. We're all clear on that? In the show, he's just not. Okay, so yeah, Aang comes up behind her and tells her she's a natural. Firstly, I don't know if that's true, but secondly, that's not true for the cartoon. In the cartoon, he was a natural, and Katara genuinely struggled to get it right.
You know, you should be practicing too. Maybe later.
Maybe never, you little shit. Aang lets on that he has trouble training with anyone else, as Gyatso was his one and only master. This isn't an element discussed in the cartoon, as Aang just kind of understood that if he's the Avatar, he can't learn all the elements from one guy. Also in the cartoon, Gyatso specifically specifies himself as his guardian. Now, those can be the same thing, but it's an interesting distinction that Aang probably trained under more than one airbending master. Katara then jokingly water whips him with some water. This is something else she desperately struggled with in episode 9. The feast that Team Avatar eats is directly lifted from episode 4 again, but in the cartoon, Sokka isn't eating during this scene, because he's sad he got beaten by a girl. Coco, I assume Coco, she was the only named child in Kyoshi Island in the cartoon, asks Aang to demonstrate his airbending. He does this by lifting a spoon and putting it in her hand, but in the cartoon he does this by performing an airbending trick, with 2 marbles spinning in a circle. Aang then runs out to play with the kids as Katara tells Sokka, and the audience, more about Aang. Next up, Zhao learning from interrogating Zuko's crew that the Avatar is alive. I mentioned earlier that he did this in the cartoon, but the difference is that he did this with Zuko present in his office. Not a plot hole, but I do wonder how they questioned his crew if Zuko had already left. Now, Suki's surprising Sokka while training with his boomerang. Firstly, he tells her that he's made it himself, but in the cartoon we get no explanation on where this boomerang came from. It's really hard to tell, but I think proportionally the boomerang is actually bigger than it was in the cartoon. Sokka then murders a poor cantaloupe, and Suki throws her fan with about as much respect for the laws of physics as Captain America's shield. Sokka engages with her in hand-to-hand combat, taps out, looks at her weird, and leaves. This scene isn't in the cartoon at all, but it does have roots in the scene I mentioned earlier where he tries to brag to her and she humiliates him. Katara explaining to Aang that Kyoshi was an orphan is exclusive to the show. Well, specifically it's not in the cartoon. In the Avatar novel Rise of Kyoshi, apparently she wasn't an orphan, but abandoned by her outlaw parents, and did serve as a housemaid to the richest family in the village. Fun fact about that novel, apparently the same richest family believed that their son was the Avatar, until Kyoshi basically outperformed them, so that's kinda neat. The poster of Kyoshi slaying Chin the Conqueror is a reference to Avatar Day, episode 5 of book 2. There's no poster like this in the cartoon, though. Aang talking about not wanting to hurt people is taken from the cartoon, as an ongoing theme that comes up organically when it needs to.
I know, I'm even a vegetarian.
Aang needing to learn how to control his powers is exclusive to the show. Well, airbending powers specifically. The only example I have of Aang not being able to control his bending is when he learns firebending for the first time with Zhong in episode 16. And he was an airbending prodigy, but that's all we got. He also mentions that kids were scared of him, but the only cartoon equivalent I have for this is that after he's revealed to be the Avatar, the other kids don't want to play with him because it might give one team an unfair advantage. Katara gives him a pep talk about trying being better than not trying, but again, this was never an element he needed help with in the cartoon. She wraps this up by telling Aang that all the Avatars are past incarnations of himself, but in the cartoon, this information was revealed via the Avatar Shrine in the Southern Air Temple. Zuko observing Zhao's ship set sail is exclusive to the show. Their Agni Kai is the end of their first encounter in episode 3, and they wouldn't meet up again until episode 8. This is how he sets sail to Kyoshi Island, but in the cartoon, Zuko and Iroh find out via this really cool gossip scene that transfers the information from one merchant to another until it arrives at Zuko himself. In the show, Suki is kind of leading the warriors' practice, but in the cartoon she's actively training with them. Sokka begins awkwardly mimicking their movements outside, and Suki notices him, but in the cartoon, cartoon, after taking a minute to sulk, he enters the dojo and asks them directly to train him, apologizing for his past actions. Sokka and Suki have this intimate training session in the show, but in the cartoon this doesn't happen at all, and Sokka doesn't do any training with her without wearing the same ritual dress as the Kyoshi warriors. More on this later. Aang sits in front of the Kyoshi statue, meditates, and enters the spirit world, where he can commune with Kyoshi. Okay, so let's take this one bit at a time. In the cartoon, communing with past avatars is something the avatar can do at will, but as I understand it, he would need to have been trained in mastering the avatar state as Aang did with the Guru in Book 2. Finding a way for Aang to talk to his past lives is actually a really big hurdle to get over in Book 1. Next, sitting in front of the past avatar statue is how Aang communed with Roku during the winter solstice in episode 8, but it wasn't meditating in front of it that allowed him to meet with him, as being there even minutes before the sun was in the right spot wouldn't allow their meeting. Aang also doesn't meditate to achieve this conversation. Also, you may have picked up on it as well, but the first avatar we meet in the cartoon is Avatar Roku, Aang's most previous life. Avatar Kyoshi only actually appears during Avatar Day in Book 2. And I don't exactly know how, so don't ask me, Lamau. Next up, Zuko being impatient about traveling to Kyoshi Island. The two talk about the 3 years away from home, so I can finally mention this tidbit. Zuko's banishment happened 2 years before the pilot episode. He mentions that it's 3 years in episode 1 of Book 2, on the anniversary of his banishment. Anyway, Sokka continues training with Suki, where he comes clean about his protection role in the South Pole, where she takes off her makeup. She doesn't do this in Book 1. The earliest we see her without her makeup is in Book 2, Episode 12, and all of her appearances in Book 3. Suki's mother noticing her isn't in the cartoon either. Ayo, why is everyone peeping on everyone else? What the fuck? Pedantic note, but there's no town alarm in the cartoon. Instead, the magistrate just grabs Suki and Sokka and notifies them of an attack. Now back to Kyoshi. Okay, y'all, here we go. I'll have you know I rewatched the entire cartoon just for this explanation to make sure I didn't miss anything. Kyoshi tells Aang that the Avatar state is the ultimate power, a combination of all his past lives focusing their energy through him. Kyoshi primarily identifies it as a weapon. In episode 1 of Book 2, as an Earth Kingdom general tries to force Aang into the Avatar state, Roku appears to Aang and explains what the Avatar state is.
The Avatar state is a defense mechanism designed to empower you with the skills and knowledge of all the past avatars.
The bit about focusing the energy is one-to-one though, so that's really cool. Roku says that you're at your most powerful in the Avatar state, but doesn't directly identify it as a weapon. Matter of fact, Kyoshi herself uses it for defense against Chin the Conqueror. Roku also clarifies that although it is powerful, it is dangerous, for if you're killed in the Avatar state, the reincarnation cycle will be broken and the Avatar will cease to exist. Seems like kind of important information to leave out of the explanation of the Avatar. Let's just keep it rolling with all the Kyoshi explanations while we're at it. Generally speaking, Kyoshi is far more mean than she is in the cartoon. Aang has a conversation with her in the finale, and even though she is firm and stern, she doesn't flat out shame him for being away for 100 years. Kind of a weird move since she is him. A self-hating avatar was never part of the original cartoon. Kyoshi also shows Aang a vision of the Northern Water Tribe being attacked. This is a reference to when Aang talks to Roku, and Roku shows him a vision of Sozin's Comet. Here's the difference though. The Avatar in his past lives can't show you things you don't already know. Otherwise, it's just an omniscient power that can see through walls. The reason Roku could show Aang Sozin's Comet is because his past lives have seen it and experienced it. None of the Avatar's past have experienced something in the future. So there shouldn't really be a reason Kyoshi can show Aang that the Water Tribe is in danger. This also means that while the cartoon made episode 8 the episode that we established the endgame stakes, the show still has yet to mention that Aang has to defeat the Fire Lord before the comet arrives. And the last bit about Kyoshi, her inhabiting Aang's body and using the power of a fully realized avatar to defend Kyoshi Island. This is a reference to when Roku does this to Aang during the solstice. But firstly, Roku asks Aang if he's ready.
I can help you face the threat, but only if you are ready.
Kyoshi does not. Secondly, the power disappears when the solstice ends, but in the show, Kyoshi disappears because reasons. This also allows us to view a fully realized avatar in the show, but in the cartoon, the first time we see an avatar actually bend all 4 elements in rapid succession is Avatar Day, during Kyoshi's flashback. So same character, but the show does this as episode 2, the cartoon does it as book 2. At least the 2 part remained the same, right? Now, let's go back in order again. Zuko arriving on the shores of Kyoshi Island to see that Zhao is already there. In the cartoon, Zuko is the only one who arrives on the shore, and Zhao isn't involved in this attack at all. When Zuko lands, there's no conversation with the locals, so the Fire Nation talking to the magistrate isn't a thing that happens. Also, sorry, I really can't get over that Suki is about to fight the Fire Nation without her war paint on. The Fire Nation attack in the cartoon is done through rhinos, but on foot in the show. The magistrate is involved in the fighting in the show, but not in the cartoon. Aang being incapacitated for the fight isn't in the cartoon either. There's only one scene where Zuko is trying to get at Aang when he's meditating, and that's during the Siege of the North, the finale to Book 1. Katara does protect Aang during that moment though, so maybe the fight they have is based on this, but it's a mostly show exclusive element to set up a character arc for her. Katara's PTSD about coming this close to firebenders is also unique to the show. Now, in the show, the Fire Nation retreats from the village due to Kyoshi's avatar spirit, but in the cartoon, Katara says that they should leave, hoping that the Fire Nation follows. She's right, and no side is actually defeated during the engagement at Kyoshi. This is kind of echoed in the show, with Suki telling Aang to leave, but all the breath is taken out of the sails since the Fire Nation has already retreated. The sentiment that Avatar Aang gave Kyoshi Island hope again is a consistent theme of the cartoon, especially most of Book 1. The first time it shows up is kind of episode 6 when Haru and his father talk to Katara, even if "you gave us hope" isn't directly said. Suki and Sokka kiss, but in the cartoon she only kisses him on the cheek. They kiss for the first time during the Serpent's Pass, episode 12 of book 2. She also gives him a fan to remember her, which is exclusive to the show. Sokka's newfound adventure spirit is a conclusion from earlier in this episode when he wanted to go home, but it doesn't have any legs in the cartoon. Aang explains to his friends that Kyoshi said he can only call upon them when he's in their shrines. Which, number one, no she didn't, Lamau. And number two, this is very different from the cartoon, where the Avatar could call upon his past lives anywhere. And finally, Aang plots a course to the Northern Water Tribes, specifically to stop an incoming attack. Katara says that he could find a waterbending master there. Just him though, cause fuck Katara, I guess. And now, Zhao apologizes to Zuko and Iroh about his attack on Kyoshi. An apology is out of the question for Zhao in the cartoon. The respect shown to these two is almost exclusively to Iroh, as Zuko being a banished prince seems to hamper his respectability. And Zhao writing a letter to the Fire Lord about the Avatar's return is another show exclusive. It's not exactly specified when the Fire Lord learns of the Avatar's return, but it sure as hell wasn't from Zhao. Also, would be remiss to not mention the great care that went into hiding Ozai's face in the cartoon. In book 1, he was only ever a black shadowy figure. In book 2, his face was always obscured. And only in book 3, the final season of the show, do we get to see his face revealed in the first episode as he welcomes Zuko home. I actually would like to talk about this more, so we're gonna start with this in the analysis. Fire Lord Ozai's face was kept a mystery for a reason in the cartoon. They wanted to amp up the mystery and allow audiences to fear the unknown. Only in book 3 was his face actually revealed, and the only reason it was revealed was because Zuko earned it. He's only talking to Zuko and revealing his face because he had conquered Ba Sing Se. It also allowed Zuko to be a surrogate for the audience. It's elements like these that were missed in the show, and it isn't the only example of it, which is why this episode is a microcosm of specificity. There's a lot of small details that were just missed, and this episode really makes it hard to ignore them. For now, let's return to the beginning of the episode. Why add the scene about Zuko's frustrations that the Ultimate Warrior ran away? Well, forgive my rudeness, but it almost seems part of a concerted effort to make Zuko a little bitch. He whines and complains, and even later in this episode with Zhao,
Don't tell anyone.
it sounds desperate. The show seems to want to exemplify him as a whiny and spoiled brat, like when he asks Zhao's men for their reports. Zuko was never like this in the cartoon. Sure, he was broody, and boy oh boy was he dramatic, but his choice to ask Iroh to keep the Avatar's existence a secret was a strategic one, not a desperate one. So the show is making a choice with his character here. Is it good? I mean, I don't know. I'll leave it up to you to decide. Do you like dramatic and broody, or whiny and spoiled? Which actually transitions me nicely to talking about Sokka's character arc, and what was a really hot button topic when it was announced: Sokka's sexism. All of the scenes with him and Suki in the show are devoid of the cartoon's women can't be fighters undertones. I remember back when this was announced, and I was honestly a little worried about it at the time. Having the final Team Avatar composition be an equal sphere of men and women shows that Sokka's really come a long way in respecting them as fighters. And similar to Aang, having him start from a lower place and having him pick himself up through humility sounded like a good thing. But consider this, right? You can still tell that story without the sexism. Sokka doesn't take the Kyoshi warriors seriously on the show, just as he doesn't take them seriously in the cartoon. The only difference is speaking aloud something sexist like,
There's no way a bunch of girls took us down.
Stuff that in a vacuum just kind of sounds vile. So, my opinions have changed. It's not like they removed his arc of humility, they just removed the specific words around it. He began his journey thinking that he was a great warrior, saw that there were other great warriors, and learned from them. So, since the journeys are the same, I'm not gonna say he should have been sexist, because that just kind of sounds weird. With that said, I still do have some words to say about this journey. Like, why doesn't Sokka wear the Kyoshi warrior dress like he did in the cartoon? You could say, well, it's not sexist in the show, so he doesn't need to resolve that, but it's not about Sokka when he puts it on in the cartoon. The cartoon takes this moment to specifically clarify that the dresses are ceremonial, where the silk threads symbolize the bravery that flows through the veins, and the gold insignia represents the honor of a warrior's heart. It turned this culture into something realistic and badass, and it was just some small line while Sokka was training. And while the cartoon was being very specific about their world, I guess you could say that the show was doing the same. Suki clarifies that the female avatar wearing Kyoshi warrior gear was in fact a Kyoshi warrior, and trained like the rest of them. No, I'm not gonna be generous. That doesn't feel specific, it feels lazy. Like, come on, I could have figured that out, or at least inferred, or guessed. I mean, the show continues its streak of being super clear and leaving no room for imagination in its audience. Alright, enough about specificity. Let's return to our favorite question. Why is it different? Well, the relationship they're playing at between Suki and Sokka is accelerated in the live action. The cartoon took them 2 seasons to kiss for the first time, but by book 3 they were fucking. My guess would be that the show just doesn't want to spend time slow rolling something it thinks the audience already knows it's coming. But one thing that the show has made very clear is that Katara and Aang will not be having a thing. I have some interviews from the creators of the show saying that the flow of the entire show is going to be different. Well, obviously. Most evident by the end of the series, where they tease Sozin's comet, but they don't even put a date on it. They elected to remove the book 1 romance between our protagonists because in live action it was way more apparent that there's a big age gap. A consequence of this is that it allows the romance subplots to be dumped onto Sokka. Not like he didn't have romantic subplots in the cartoon. Dude was swimming in it, to be honest. But the interviews also talk about giving Sokka more depth and more to do in the show, trying trying to expand upon his character. So Sokka gets more, and Katang gets nothing. Now, Zuko's diary. I had already mentioned that this is one of the new ideas that the show wants to throw at audiences, and I love it. However, it does definitely hamper the agency of our characters a bit. It's essentially a roadmap to all the important things that need to happen in Season 1. I mentioned this briefly, but Aang goes to Kyoshi Island to ride the elephant koi, making it the 4th or 5th destination on their way to the North Pole, with its primary role being that Aang is a goofy kid and he just wants to have fun. He visited for fun, not for his mission, and I think that's important to build who Aang is. Building characters up means that they need to start from a flawed place. Seeing Avatar Aang was so satisfying because he started in a place where his first words on the topic were,
I never wanted to be.
I'm just saying, be prepared for the finale to be disappointed if they're going to continue to neglect the flawed aspects of our characters. So why is it different? Well, what does it allow to have happen? We already talked about it giving a roadmap to Kyoshi, but another casualty is the Avatar Shrine in the Southern Air Temple. Part of me is kind of relieved we didn't get yet another explanation of the reincarnation cycle, since we already got 3. But let's look at that scene in the cartoon a little closer. What is it setting up? What does it say? I think it specifically is to show Avatar Roku, the Avatar before Aang. He's an instrumental character for Aang's development as an Avatar, and the show makes it known that he was from the Fire Nation. It allows the mysticism of the Avatar to persist, which is removed from the show, and establish that the world is out of balance if the last Avatar could have been from the Fire Nation himself, which is spelled out from the show. So given that the elements it was trying to establish were already covered, I begrudgingly think that it was necessary to have removed from the show. I still think that the subtlety and specific details of that scene trump nearly all of episode 1 for the Netflix adaptation though, but whatever. Next up, the Kyoshi statue. And we'll roll this right into her conversation with Aang as well. Why on earth did they decide to make it so that the Avatar can only commune with his past lives at specific shrines? I am supposed to have the answer to that, but I just kinda don't. First thought is it's new. It allows the audience to experience the story in a different and unexpected way. Second thought is that the writers thought it would be an overpowered ability for Aang to be able to commune with his past lives whenever he wanted. Unfortunately, that's a first pool thought though, because Aang couldn't do that until the finale, or at very, very specific parts of the year. So third and kind of rude thought, they didn't watch the cartoon, Lamau. Fourth thought, they wanted Kyoshi to come out and kick some ass, and the way that they got Roku to do that in the cartoon was through his shrine. So bing bang boom, give Kyoshi a shrine and let her avatar that bitch up. Only problem is that I always attributed Roku's ability to kick ass through Aang to the winter solstice, not the shrine. Or maybe both, I don't exactly know. But I know that when the solstice runs out, that Roku can't do it anymore, so. But like in the show world, why not just always sit near the Kyoshi statue? Why even finish your training on your own? Also, just gonna throw this out here, remember in the cartoon finale when Aang asks his past lives for advice on how to kill the Fire Lord? Good fucking luck having Aang have a conversation like this with Kyoshi. What, are you gonna have him travel all over the world in the same day just to ask your past lives what to do? So why though? Well, firstly, it remixes what the cartoon did, so fine, cool. But also, I actually point to a meta reason here. Kyoshi had a novel come out recently, and so it's more fresh in the minds of people who have seen and care about Avatar. So even if Roku is more relevant to Aang, which he definitely is, Kyoshi is more relevant to the world from a meta standpoint. And those are only the thoughts on the statue itself. Let's quickly talk about the contents of our conversation, and then about the Avatar state. So in the cartoon equivalent scene, Roku shows Aang Sozin's comet, he gives him his warning and his mission that he must defeat the Fire Lord before the comet comes at the end of the summer. In the show scene, Kyoshi informs Aang through a spirit premonition, I guess, that the North Pole will be attacked, and he must stop it. It is painfully dull to replace the motivation for visiting the Northern Water Tribe. Like, what was wrong with his motivation of needing a waterbending master? Why did they change this? Well, I think it was a really tunnel-visioned approach to try to make Kyoshi give Aang a vision like Roku did. I've already spoken about why it's broken, so let's just move on and say it's really disappointing. The story writers, for whatever reason, didn't think that his motivations for literally being the Avatar was enough for Aang to visit the North Pole. What the fuck ever. Alright, now the Avatar state. When Kyoshi takes control of Aang, she uses her fire fist to fly around the island. So that nullifies the idea that the Fire Nation can only reach the air temples with this tech during the comet, because here she's just doing it. It's also just unimaginative. Do you realize how many unique ways there are to travel as an earthbender? And they instead just decide to make her fly. Like, how fucking boring. Now, I want to talk about how the Kyoshi Island conflict ends. In the cartoon, Zuko sees Team Avatar leaving and decides to follow them. In the show, Zhao orders a retreat because Avatar Kyoshi kicks their asses. If you can't see the difference in these two, it's defeat. No side was defeated in the cartoon, but in the show, the Fire Nation was unequivocally losers. So why? In the cartoon, when Roku took control of Aang, he sank his own shrine into the volcano and forced the Fire Nation to retreat. So I imagine the writers were just trying to transplant that moment onto this one. But why does it work with Roku and not Kyoshi? I think it's because of the specifics that went into him appearing at his shrine, in the Fire Nation, mind you, during a solstice, with the help of a traitorous Fire Nation sage. Like, there were just a lot of moving parts to that fight. And even then, Team Avatar barely escapes. It just feels more earned and strenuous than it did on Kyoshi in the show. Moving along to some miscellaneous stuff now, the Magistrate is a woman now. I think they just wanted to give Suki a familial connection in the show, which she Kyoshi was lacking in the cartoon. So I think that's why the magistrate itself was changed. But what about the island? Well, I think it's kind of obvious from them explaining out that Kyoshi made these warriors in her own image that the writers put an overinflated sense of worth in the Kyoshi warriors. They were just the protectors of this island. They weren't the end-all be-all of this culture. Speaking of revolving around the Kyoshi warriors, let's talk about my favorite one, Ty Lee. Wait, no, sorry, that's the cartoon. Suki. I really love episode 4 of book 1 for the cartoon because I think it does strong women right as far as not pushing too hard in either direction. They're women, they're warriors. Neither of those two are capitalized. They were strong, they didn't take any shit, but when Sokka had to leave, after him and Suki had developed a connection, they have this interaction.
I am a warrior, but I'm a girl too.
And it leaves this episode in a really awesome place of don't forget one element just because you're focusing on another. So now, let's look at the show. Peeping. Jesus, guys, I'm not sure if this is more, like, realistic, but it sure as fuck feels more creepy. I know I've gotten mad at the show, like, making the characters vomit up their feelings, but you guys could just, like, talk to each other, you know? As for a possible explanation, Suki falling for the most arrogant guy she's ever met would make sense if he was the only guy she ever met. Does it make sense that way? Yeah, I guess. Do I like it? No, not even a little. I think it really cheapens Suki's feelings for Sokka. I also think their love just doesn't make a lot of sense in the show. Let's map it out. In the cartoon, she ambushes him, he insults her, he tries to show off to her and get schooled, he humbles himself, and allows himself to be taught their fighting techniques. Him and her bond organically over getting better. Then he saves her life when the Fire Nation arrives. Then they share a kiss on the cheek and he leaves in a hurry. Fellas, let me assure you that admitting your faults, humbling yourself, and apologizing is very attractive. And now the show. She ambushes them, he's arrogant about it, she peeps on him, she shows him up at his training, and he wasn't even really being arrogant at that point. He peeps on them, she teaches him, they almost kiss, the Fire Nation attacks, he defends her, the danger is halted, and they smooch. It just doesn't feel as organic, or realistic, I suppose. Eliminating the necessity for Team Avatar to leave so quickly means that he could have stayed. I mean, dude totally could have boned her. Switching to some other stuff again, Zhao is a completely different character. In the cartoon, he was arrogant, straight up rude, which may or may not have purely been because Zuko is a banished prince. He was respectable enough to Iroh. But in the show, dude is a bootlicker. Okay, maybe bootlicker's a little strong. In reality, more of what it is that he's sucking up to the Fire Nation royalty so he can garner favor, which is in line with what happens in the rest of the show. But is this really necessary to do with Zuko? Because at the end of the encounter, he just ends up sending a letter to the Fire Lord himself anyway. Again, in fairness, maybe he didn't know it was going to get this big, but his personality was always ambitious in the cartoon, and this just seems like less than the Zhao I remember. So why make this change? Well, for starters, it throws a new wrench into a familiar formula that we're all accustomed to seeing. Seeing Zuko and Iroh deal with someone who is very conniving and slippery is a new challenge for them. I mean, unless you consider Azula in the cartoon. I also think from a meta standpoint that the trope of the overly arrogant villain is going downhill, as we've seen them pop up less and less in media these days. Yes, obviously, it's more engaging to see a villain who has layers, and I think that a lot of really great shows have done really great things with a very charismatic villain, especially since the original Avatar cartoon didn't really have any of those. But hang on, why is that? I think the original cartoon didn't have that specifically because the Fire Nation wasn't like that. It was a culture thing, especially in book 1. It was really important to establish that the Fire Nation were ruthless, very serious. Zhao fulfills that role very well in book 1, and only after book 1 is concluded do we get a more manipulative villain in Azula. But Azula had to wait because we first had to establish that the Firebenders were mean and evil people. Okay, hashtag not all, but you know what I mean. Overall, it's definitely a change, and it's definitely interesting to play up an angle that hasn't really been explored in this world before. Is that better or worse? Well, I'll leave that for you to decide. I think both ways have their merits. I will say, with the story they're trying to tell for Zhao in the show, it would be a little difficult to use his cartoon personality. Moving right along, let's talk about the scene where Team Avatar is enjoying the feast that the island put on for them. Since the scene was in the cartoon, I don't really have to go over broad strokes, so let me go on instead about the little things that I think add up. This scene concludes with Aang stepping outside to play with the kids a little bit, and Katara tells Sokka and the audience that Aang is good with people, giving us the worst expositional dialogue I've ever seen in my entire life.
That's his real power. Connection. Building bridges. That's how he's gonna be the Avatar.
Like, did we really need that? We can obviously see that he's fine at talking his way out of things, and he likes playing with kids. It just adds more points to telling and not showing anything. The cartoon never had to do this, and if we're really keeping score, Aang was much better at talking his way out of trouble in the cartoon. That might have something to do with the acting, though. I've been putting it off for a little while in this analysis, but I guess I'll mention it a little bit here. The acting in the show is just flat. I really don't want to be rude to these actors because they're actually like 13 years old, but truth is, when you have actors that young, you don't have a lot of life experience to draw on when you're acting. And sometimes you get performances like this.
The enemy? I'm not the enemy.
Comparatively, I think the cartoon had much better acting from the cast.
Why am I so bad at being good?
But that's all I'm gonna say about the matter, because again, I don't want to dunk on these teenagers. Also at the end of this scene is Aang airbending a spoon. Remember last episode when I talked about how bending in the cartoon was a full body activity, and the show seems to get that wrong a little bit? Well, hey, credit where credit is due. This bit of airbending into the little girl's hands is actually a really good example of full body bending.
You've got to feel the flow.
But while we're talking about the little details and how they add up, let's talk about the scene at the Kyoshi Island statue. Aang and Katara do their research on the past Avatar's life, and I think that's fine. It wasn't in the original cartoon, but I think that was really just because they didn't have time. I think they made this change because of the meta reasons surrounding the character. Again, she was very present in people's minds when the show was airing because of her novels, so that's fine really. What I can't abide as it continues to plague the show is the show simply not doing its homework and not checking the details before pressing send. Prime example, Katara says Kyoshi served the richest family on the island, but it wouldn't have been an island until she made it that way. It was a village before that. Creating Kyoshi Island is kind of like Avatar Kyoshi's defining thing. More details are missed when Aang explains that he did have to train to control his powers. And this isn't even across media, this is entirely insulated to the show. Aang explains to Katara that he's never trained with anybody who's not Monk Gyatso, but in this flashback he's very clearly training with somebody who's not Monk Gyatso. Like, why even establish that Aang is only trained with one dude if you're going to immediately contradict it with a flashback in this episode? Did you think I wouldn't notice? Last bit in regards to details that are missed, Aang has a signature bow that he does when he shows people respect in the cartoon. Just picture it in your head, come on, you know the one I'm talking about. He puts his hands together, right? So when I saw the villagers of Kyoshi bowing to him for saving their lives, I thought this is the easiest layup ever. Just have Aang bow the way that we're all familiar with. And then he didn't! Like seriously, I feel like I'm building a mountain of evidence that the people who produced this show didn't watch the original cartoon. And I didn't want to be building a mountain of evidence, but here we are. Since I'm already complaining about the show, let's talk about some of the writing. Specifically the dialogue.
Ridiculous. There would have been signs if he was the Avatar.
I think that might be a sign.
This shit is like the most forced Marvel humor I've ever heard in my entire life. I wouldn't be surprised if by the end of the show we get a, he's right behind me, isn't he? Like seriously. I just wanted to address it because this shit makes me cringe. It was almost excusable when the cartoon did it because they were literal children, but Suki and Sokka are the oldest of the group. They cannot afford to be making me cringe this hard. And you know what? Fuck it. No, I'm taking it back. The cartoon was not cringy. The dialogue was beautiful. Okay, so I think I talked about everything else. Let's move on now to the Fire Nation attack. Firstly, Aang in the spirit world while Katara defends him. Let me just say, this is a really cool set piece that I wish they used more in the cartoon. In the cartoon, it was definitely earned, since when this happened, Katara was significantly stronger than she would be at this point in the show, almost making it a fair fight. Which actually segues into my next point. When did Team Avatar consciously fight Zuko for the first time? That's a rhetorical question, don't worry. I'm just trying to make the point that in episode 4, they didn't. They avoided him and ran away because they knew that they wouldn't be able to take on the might of the Fire Nation. This is a theme that persists in Book 1, and yes, sometimes Aang is the exception, but he's the Avatar, he kinda has to be. But he's also an airbending master. He can go toe-to-toe with Zuko. Katara, however, only receives formal training at the very end of the season, and she only fights Zuko for the first time in the finale of Book 1. All of this points to the idea that she should not be able to defend Aang from Zuko here, and to be fair, she doesn't. She gets beat pretty bad pretty instantly. And honestly, I don't necessarily blame her character. Like, what would you have done in her position? Let Zuko take Aang? No, I blame the writers for putting this situation in episode 2 rather than episode 8. At the very least, this encounter did actually give us a new show-exclusive idea to work with, Katara's PTSD. It's actually kind of interesting because I thought she would definitely have PTSD in the cartoon, but she never really does. Now, let's look at the surrounding elements. It was a kid's cartoon, so the occasional nightmare is kind of the scariest thing they can get away with. But if the show is going to insist on making itself more adult, I am really glad that they threw this in. Despite this though, being strong and confident enough to fight Zuko is not something that should happen this early. By episode 2 of the show, she's doing things she was only able to do in episode 10 of the cartoon. And for reference, episode 10 was halfway through the season. And with that reference point, I kind of have a good guess as to why they're changing it this way. I think the writers were worried about making Katara dead weight. And to be clear, she was never dead weight in the cartoon, not even from episode 1. I mean, she released the Avatar for God's sake. But in Book 1 especially, it did kind of make the fight scenes almost exclusively belong to Aang, or other miscellaneous people who were present, but not Katara, because she wasn't trained. So I see why they were doing it like this in the show, but even then, I just don't really like it. I feel like they needed to have a period where Katara didn't really know what she was doing, and in the show, that basically lasted for like 10 minutes. Another miscellaneous thing that I needed to talk about is Momo's involvement. Yeah, I really do mean that. In the cartoon, Momo was involved in a handful of fight scenes, and his involvement was usually very removed. Not to pretend he didn't exist, because there were some big moments where Momo really did save the day. But his involvement was never really direct actions on soldiers like this. The worst we ever really get is him jumping on Zhao's head during the North Pole. Other than that, he really just played a supporting role during the fighting, unlike the show where he's a direct attacker. Small thing, but hey, that's what I'm here for. And while we're being pedantic, Momo doesn't make monkey noises. He is a lemur. And I don't really have much else to say about the fight. I know this episode was kind of me jumping all over the place because I wanted to talk about specific elements instead of doing it chronologically. Sticking chronologically, there is the last scene I wanted to mention, Team Avatar's departure. Katara tells Aang that he can learn from the waterbending masters in the North Pole, and in the cartoon, Aang excitedly says,
"We can learn it together!"
But in the show, he just doesn't. I don't know why the show is insisting on destroying the relationship between our characters, but moments like this really showed that they were all in this together, and they really were an equal part of Team Avatar. I'm really really, really just not feeling those vibes from the show. They don't feel like Team Avatar, they feel like the Avatar and his entourage. And I think that's really sad, because I feel like the friendship and team dynamic between them was the glue that held the entire cartoon together. It's what made the endless reruns of The Great Divide actually tolerable. If you watch the show on cable, you know what I mean. We start off episode 3 with another view of Capital City in the Fire Nation. Before we go past that, let me just say that we are spending way more time in the city than we ever did in the cartoon. The cartoon told the story from much more of a third-person limited perspective, and very rarely did it have scenes that weren't directly in the view of our characters. So with that said, this scene to introduce Azula is exclusive to the show. The scene introducing Azula in the cartoon was at the tail end of book 1, but her first real scene is telling the Royal Guard that they will be bringing in Zuko and Iroh, and telling the captain that she'll kill him if he doesn't bring the ship in despite the treacherous tides. There's no scene whatsoever about an insurgency inside the Fire Nation. Don't worry, I'll talk about that later. For now, more training for Katara. Katara's training sessions are actually littered in small doses across the entirety of the cartoon, but training the Water Whip specifically is from episode 9 when she acquires the Water Scroll. Aang, notably, is not training his waterbending, but I'll talk about that later too. He gives Katara a pep talk, and we get the first glimpse of the idea that bending comes from emotion. So let's talk about that quick, since that is a concept from the cartoon. As early as episode 1, when Katara accidentally frees Aang, we can see that bending comes from emotion. Or it can. There's a much larger talk about this topic in episode 13 of book 3, when Zuko loses his firebending ability because he used to channel it from his anger and rage, and doesn't wish to bend that way anymore. On the other side of the spectrum, Azula is a cold-hearted psychopath who can bend even the hottest fire without feeling anything. As I understand it, bending from emotion is most definitely possible, but similar to how the first benders learned their skills, there's a discipline associated with it that would allow you to bend without tapping into your emotions. Iroh talks about this periodically with Zuko, saying,
"No, power in firebending comes from the breath."
No emotion required. When Aang learns earthbending, moving his first rock is a huge hurdle for him, and despite all the stance work and strict training, it's actually an emotional response to move the rock for the first time, after Toph spent the whole day pissing him off. So, all of this to say that bending can come from emotions, but it's definitely a fickle source. Aang, as a master of a bending discipline, should not be encouraging her to use her emotions, as they aren't a stable source for bending power. But shoulda, woulda, coulda. They end the conversation once again by talking about going to the Northern Water Tribe. Next we're on Appa, where Sokka misses Suki, Katara once again gives him shit, and Aang spots another airbender. They follow him and just kind of stumble upon OMASHU. In the cartoon, OMASHU occupies the entirety, and only the entirety, of episode 5. And they sought it out specifically as one of the destinations that Aang can go goof around in, as he remembers enjoying the mail delivery system with his old friend Bumi. Moving right along, we have Zuko, Iroh, and Zhao plotting where the Avatar will go next. There isn't a scene like this in the cartoon, as Zhao was basically as much of an enemy to Zuko as Aang was. As Zhao leaves, Zuko gets told some gossip about him from one of his crew, and snaps at him being rude. This is actually a reference to episode 12, but in that episode it's set up for Iroh explaining Zuko's past. Zuko's rudeness towards the crew is limited to that episode. Moving along, Aang talks up OMASHU and they head towards the main gate. Super minor detail that was probably an accident, but they approach on foot in both mediums, so that's neat. The cabbage merchant being booted aggressively is also one-to-one from both mediums as well. On their way in, they get talked to by this heartthrob, who tells them that they don't take kindly to outsiders. But in the cartoon, they're the only ones attempting to enter OMASHU at this time. Sneaking into the city is also taken from the cartoon. We're on a roll here. It is different though, as Aang uses Appa's fur to create a mustache and become Bonzu Pippin-Paddle-Opsicopoulos III. There's also overlap with Katara going along with the plan in both mediums, except she's...
Irrigation, am I right?
June Pippin-Paddle-Opsicopoulos. Nice to meet you.
better in the cartoon, I think. Guys, the gates even open the same way in both mediums. They are crushing it. Think they'll keep this up over the whole episode? Anyway, getting into the city and showing off the market and mercantilism is unique to the show. Heartthrob here is also unique to the show, and I call him that because, well, he doesn't really give us his name. He warns them that OMASHU can be a dangerous place, but there's actually no indication of that in the cartoon. Aang spots the airbender and decides to chase after the flying guy on foot, and upon catching up to him, discovers it to be Tio, a wheelchair-bound kid who learned how to glide through the air. Tio was a character from the cartoon, but the circumstances are like, literally couldn't be more different. Tio was part of a refugee community that moved into the Northern Air Temple in episode 17 of Book 1, the same community that the Mechanist was a part of. They moved into the Northern Air Temple after finding it abandoned and made it their home, and through studying the air nomad culture discovered how to develop glider technology, which also led to the development of the war balloon. They weren't connected to OMASHU in the slightest. Matter of fact, OMASHU is on the southernmost side of the Earth Kingdom continent, and the Northern Air Temple is, well, really close to the North Pole. Really, the only similarities are that the Mechanist is an inventor, and Teo is in a wheelchair. The next beat about an explosion in OMASHU is exclusive to the show. There isn't an attack of any kind in OMASHU, actually. It's an Earth Kingdom stronghold from the Fire Nation. In the show, Teo is blown away by Katara and Aang's bending abilities. For Aang, this is kind of similar to the cartoon, although he immediately pegs him as the Avatar as well. For Katara, he doesn't directly see her waterbend in that episode, or if he does, he doesn't really comment on it. Also, interestingly enough, the Mechanist isn't given a name in the cartoon. His name is Sai in the Netflix show, but he was always just the Mechanist in the original cartoon. The name Sai is specifically a show exclusive. While we're talking about him, he doesn't actually introduce himself, and neither does Katara. His introduction is destroying a wall of the temple and Aang getting pissed about it. He explains their refugee origins and then leaves to check on a gas leak problem. So now, I'm gonna be crystal clear so I don't have to just say it with every scene in the minute. Sai and Teo were never in OMASHU in the cartoon, so literally everything involving them in the city is a show exclusive. A handful of things they talk about have scenes of the cartoon, so I'll mention those. Additionally, OMASHU had absolutely no Fire Nation presence, not even spies, in the cartoon. The closest thing that happens in the cartoon is when the Fire Nation conquers OMASHU in Book 2. Okay, now that there's no longer any confusion, let's continue. Teo mentions that Aang can use his airbending powers to take the fight to the enemy, controlling the skies. This is a reference to the Northern Air Temple again when the Fire Nation attack, and through the use of gliders and air superiority, the refugees repel them. Although it's actually Aang who points this out to Teo, not the other way around. Sai is extremely humble in the show. He didn't really get a chance to be brash or arrogant in the cartoon, but the show makes it seem like he doesn't realize how important his role as an inventor is. Oh, quick visual difference time. Sai is missing 3 fingers in the cartoon, as a result of experiments into a finger-safe knife sharpener. This detail is missing from the show. At this point, Team Avatar plans to leave OMASHU, as they found the reason for arriving in the first place. In the cartoon, they have a harder time leaving OMASHU, as they get captured for messing around with the mail delivery system. Doesn't matter though, because upon Aang seeing suffering people, he decides to stay and help. This is true in its cartoon counterpart, in spirit, but not direct action, as he doesn't plan on staying in OMASHU since their people seem to be fine. Funnily enough, I could actually point to the Great Divide as a great example of Aang staying in one place longer than he needed to because people needed his help. Next up, Azula practicing archery. This never happens in the cartoon. We do see her practicing, and it's actually one of my favorite scenes about her. Practicing lightning, no less. Impressive, crazy shit. Literally almost perfect. One hair out of place.
Almost isn't good enough.
Gorgeous scene. It takes place in episode 1 of Book 2, and Azula doesn't appear in Book 1 at all. Well, except for the last scene in the finale, but I don't really count that. So the fact that she's in this story at all is a massive departure, and similar to Sai and OMASHU, I'm not going to mention it every time, but to be super clear, the events happening going forward were originally Azula-less. The closest thing we get to Azula practicing her target practice is in episode 7 of Book 2, when Azula puts an apple on Mei's head and shoots it with fire, forcing Zuko to save her and embarrass himself. In the show, she's practicing with the Wuhan archers, but they appear in a later episode, so I'll talk about them then. They're very, very isolated within their role in the story, and Azula never trains with them. This scene also introduces Mei and Ty Lee into our story, which, let's just say, is very different than the cartoon. In the cartoon, Ty Lee is at the circus when Azula finds her, and Mei is with her governor father in OMASHU after the Fire Nation captured it. Azula and Ty Lee run into her, and she decides to go with them after a scuffle with Team Avatar. Azula and friends talk about her mission to root out traitors, which, as mentioned, is a show exclusive. However, Azula's attitude about peasants is from the cartoon. She's always been a little classist. Mei mentions her envy about Zuko's situation, and that he's first in line to be Fire Lord. Both of these concepts are exclusive to the show as well, and we don't really get any solo scenes for Mei in the cartoon. Also, I'm not 100% sure on how banishment works, but I'm pretty sure a condition of being Fire Lord is that you're not banished from the country that you're trying to rule over. Just saying. Azula shoots her a dirty look, which kind of shuts Mei down. This is completely backwards from the cartoon, as Mei always had a bit more external agency outside of Azula, culminating her story by eventually betraying her.
You miscalculated. I love Zuko more than I fear you.
Now, back to Sai and Teo. He mentions that their mother was taken by the Fire Nation, but in the cartoon he explains that they lost their mother in a flood that destroyed their village, being the catalyst for their resettlement in the Air Temple. Teo mentions that the bombers are meeting high up on the mountain, specifically saying that he can't reach them there by himself, which allows me to point out another detail from the cartoon. The reason they were able to glide themselves outside the Northern Air Temple in the first place was because the Mechanist was rooting hot air outside of the temple that allowed them to catch a current. No idea whatsoever how Teo is able to fly at all without these, unless he somehow got to the very top of OMASHU, but I don't think it's very wheelchair accessible. Sai tells Teo that he can't go, as he's supposed to work on something called the airship. And yeah, I'm gonna be petty and it might get a little bit confusing, but it's not my fault, it's the show's. The show calls this an airship, but when it was in the cartoon, it was the war balloon.
A balloon, but for war.
This is what an airship looked like in the cartoon. And far be it from me to mislabel what these machines are called, I'm sure the show knows better than me. Anyway, it doesn't matter, since Sokka says he'll stay and help with it. In the cartoon, Sokka was absolutely interested in creating things, and he does help the Mechanist solve his problem of the non-functional war balloon. Teo, however, doesn't really show any interest in helping problem solve or create, and there's no expectation of him to do so from his father. Next, Zhao telling Zuko that an airbender was spotted at OMASHU, which is another show exclusive. Since Zhao isn't even friendly to them in the cartoon, there isn't a scene like this anywhere outside of the Netflix adaptation. Now, Katara practicing waterbending and slapping herself in the face. This actually may be a loose reference to when she slaps herself with the water whip in episode 9 again. And her noticing the Mechanist as a traitor is actually taken from episode 17 as well, except it's her, Aang, and Teo that discover that he's building weapons for the Fire Nation. No spies are involved. She's about to go confront him when Heartthrob is back. He introduces himself as Jet, and the two— wait, Jet? What the hell is Jet doing here? Okay, so Jet was in episode 10, titled Jet, in the cartoon. Him and his freedom fighters were interested in flooding an occupied Earth Kingdom town, not OMASHU. And he had no connection with the Mechanist whatsoever. His first interaction with Team Avatar was with Katara, so that's interesting, although he was far more suave in how he did it. Jet introduces himself and chases after the Fire Nation spy with Katara. In the cartoon, immediately after I'm Jet, he introduces us to the freedom fighters. Jet and his freedom fighters go together like peanut butter and a peanut butter allergy, so I don't know where they are and why they haven't been introduced yet. Teo and Aang quickly fly to the top of the mountain, which he invited Aang because he couldn't reach the top by himself, but here he is, reaching the top by himself. I'm just gonna accept it and move on. Jet and Katara catch up to the Fire Nation spies, which, again, is a show exclusive. Some of the ways he fights, though, like hooking his hook swords together, is taken from the cartoon, so that's kinda neat. Katara does the same waterbending form she did when she was fighting Zuko, so that's also kinda neat. And Jet finally calls his freedom fighters with a bird call in his hand, which is also a reference to the cartoon. Smellerby uses these dual knives to cut up his spy, and I gotta say, this type of fighting was never done in the cartoon because it looked too real. Even when you had two people fighting with swords, they would never make contact on each other because of the limitations of the network. Also, Longshot just sticks to trees, so that's cool. Anyway, this scene is a reference to when Jet and his freedom fighters take down a Fire Nation encampment of about 20 guys, impressing Katara, Sokka, and Aang. Jet calls himself the good guys, which is not a note from the cartoon. Jet was never quite as overt, and that's likely because he knew that he'd have to sacrifice innocent people and doesn't quite consider himself a hero for doing it. Sai and Sokka's conversation touches on his father for the first time in the show. He mentions that his father is a warrior and doesn't pay attention to his inventions. If we're comparing one-to-one, which we are, it's a blatant mischaracterization of Hakoda. Firstly, he was a warrior, but he was also the leader, and that is more often how they referred to him. Secondly, Hakoda was very often interested in new technology, congratulating and being proud of Sokka for working with the Mechanist to create the submarines in the Day of Black Sun. He even created some himself, like the Stink and Sink mines that he tells Sokka about in The Guru. I'll talk about why they changed this in a minute, but just know for now that Hakoda was one of the smartest, bravest, and purest characters in the entire cartoon. Sai mentions to Sokka that he could be an engineer, and Sokka writes it off as a hobby. In the cartoon, they never had a conversation quite this overt, but Sai does tell Sokka that he's a genius, and he humbly accepts this role and continues inventing and using his brain. Sokka's leadership and gift for planning and strategy is actually his defining attribute to Team Avatar, and he certainly earns it. Teo's conversation with Aang about his father is unique to the show as well, especially because even though Sai most definitely cared about his son in the cartoon, he had an entire refugee camp to take care of inside the Northern Air Temple. And again, since they lost their village to a flood in the cartoon, the idea about fighting back against the Fire Nation isn't burning as hard inside Teo. Jet takes Katara back to his home base, which notably is on the ground. In the cartoon, his people lived in a series of tree houses that were hidden from the Fire Nation. Jet gives exposition about the King of OMASHU, which is never explained until we actually see him in the cartoon. Teo and Aang find barrels of blasting jelly in the mountain, which is the signature explosive of the freedom fighters in the cartoon, so good detail. I do wonder why the freedom fighters didn't just hide the blasting jelly in their camp since apparently no one can find them. Why bother with the mountain? Aang discovers that the Fire Nation wasn't behind the explosion, and in case I didn't mention it, the whole insider terrorism thing is exclusive to the show. Jet then explains that his mother taught him the sword, but we don't get any origin story for Jet in the cartoon. The only thing we get are some flashback scenes of Jet reliving his trauma when they break his brainwashing in Book 2, Episode 17. Jet and Katara exchange stories about their dead parents. Aw, Dead Parents Club, love it, super cute. Which is from the cartoon as well, same Jet episode. Notably in the cartoon, she doesn't have her necklace because this was the point in the story when Zuko stole it and she hadn't retrieved it back yet. The show displays some flashbacks of what she remembers from her mother dying, but the cartoon doesn't do this. The only flashbacks we get of Katara's mother are her dying in the Fire Nation raid from the Southern Raiders, which is in episode 16 of Book 3. But don't worry, I've got a lot to say about that episode when it does come up. Katara and Jet talk a lot about her mother in the show, but she doesn't say much about her in the cartoon. Zuko and Iroh never venture into OMASHU in the cartoon. The closest approximation I can give is when they hide from the Fire Nation inside Ba Sing Se. Zuko isn't quite as elitist in the cartoon overall, but especially in Book 2, he has no room to judge people since he's just a refugee same as them. Zuko gets mad upon finding out the explosions in OMASHU were a guerrilla tactic used by the Fire Nation, believing they shouldn't be resorting to such methods. This is also an exclusive to the show. Zuko never really cared about how the job got done as long as it got done in the cartoon. He never would have said father would never approve of this. I don't think Zuko in the cartoon gives even a little bit of a shit about how his father thinks the fighting should be done. And now, Azula asking Zhao to keep tabs on Zuko. This political game never existed in the cartoon. The next scene is rather amusing, as it brings all of our show exclusive elements together. Aang telling Sokka, working alone in the Mechanist office, show exclusive, that Teo and him found blasting jelly in the mountains, show exclusive, only to be interrupted by Katara, who tells that her and Jet found Sai being a Fire Nation spy, show exclusive, and the three of them having a confusion over who the bad guy is, spoiler alert, it's kind of all of them, is a show exclusive. Nothing like this exists in the cartoon. Katara rushes off to find Jet as he's ready to murder the Mechanist, his son, and the Earth King all in one fell swoop. Jesus Christ, okay, fuck. He also explains this to Katara like it's no big deal. In the cartoon, he was planning on destroying a Fire Nation occupied town, but he did not talk to Katara about it, as he knew she wouldn't approve. It also wasn't ever as obvious as we're gonna straight up blow up a dude. I don't know if Jet in the cartoon would also be as eager to overthrow a sitting king, but he did help Team Avatar disrupt the Dai Li and Ba Sing Se, so maybe? Katara tells Jet that innocent people will die, and I would also like to point out that these words specifically are never spoken in the cartoon, because these words are really obvious and the cartoon kinda just didn't roll that way. And then, Zuko facing off against Team Avatar. Oops, JK, Aang says to leave him and he'll fight Zuko alone. Aight. These two never fight in OMASHU, and there isn't really an equivocal fight where Zuko is encouraged not to use his bending. Except maybe Zuko alone, or when he fights Jet and Ba Sing Se. But in neither of these examples is Zuko fighting Aang, so I'm grasping at straws. There's this interesting part in the show where this lady gets in the way and says, "How dare you hit that child," to Zuko, which was a part of the cartoon that intentionally got glossed over, since the power differential between Zuko and Aang was flipped in Aang's favor anyway. The only actual mention of their ages is in episode 1, when Zuko says, "You're just a child," and Aang responds,
"Well, you're just a teenager."
There's this other interesting part of when they fight, when Aang uses cloths hanging in the market to fight back against Zuko. Aang using the culture of whatever region he's in is actually a consistent theme in the cartoon, and helps make him a well-traveled avatar. He uses the fans on Kyoshi, he fights with the carts in OMASHU, it's actually a good detail to throw into the show. Next, Katara and Sokka use the mail carts to ride up to the palace, which oh my god, okay, I can't let it go. Please refer to this clip from the cartoon.
Earthbending brings the packages up, and gravity brings them down.
Someone tell me how Katara and Sokka are going up right now. Did they just ask an earthbender to send them up? This isn't a fucking train. The lack of attention to detail is really pissing me off, especially because, well, okay, I'll talk about it in the next section. We're almost there. Zuko finds out that Aang stole his diary isn't in the cartoon, whatever. Katara and Sokka arrive just in time to swat a fire arrow out of the air with waterbending. The next section's coming up. One sec, almost there. Iroh then sacrifices himself to allow Zuko to escape, for no reason basically. No one even knew who the firebender was. He didn't really need to do that. This didn't need to happen in the cartoon, so it doesn't. Show exclusive again. Then Earthbenders arrest Aang. Team Avatar does get arrested in the cartoon, but not for, putting out fires, I guess. It's for riding the mail carts and destroying a cabbage cart. And the whole team gets arrested, not just Aang. So let's start with the title I'm giving this episode, length. The show seems to really want to rush through a lot of the elements from book 1. One of the most common criticisms of the Netflix adaptation is everything happens in OMASHU, and they'd be right. Sai the Mechanist, Jet the Freedom Fighter, and Bumi of OMASHU were all elements of the cartoon that made the world feel lived in. Like there was more than just good guys and bad guys. The show instead decides to put all of these elements in the same place. So why? Bro, I fucking wish I knew. There really wasn't any reason to smush them all into one setting. I guess they thought OMASHU was boring, but that betrays the fundamental understanding of why OMASHU was important. World building. It's no secret that Avatar: The Last Airbender has some of the best world building in storytelling history, especially for a kids show. Is that an exaggeration? No, it's actually not. This is the hill I will die on. Let's talk about OMASHU as a setting. So do you know why the OMASHU delivery system was so important to the world building of the cartoon? I know that might sound like a silly question, but go with me here.
Earthbending brings the packages up, and gravity brings them down.
It was an extremely natural progression of what a world with bending would look like. In a world with such fantastic abilities, you ask what can be done to make the lives of everyday people easier. Ba Sing Se had a similar idea with their train system. Them shits didn't just move on their own, they had 2 earthbenders in the back pushing it along. It was a way for people with a natural gift to help shape the world around them. Another example is the Northern Water Tribe, where they used their waterbending abilities to raise and lower the canal system to allow boats to travel in. Or the entire architectural structure of the air temples, specifically high above the ground so only those with access or respect to airbending could reach them. The Fire Nation has less examples to draw from since they're the bad guys, but the boiling rock comes to mind, a prison built in a volcano, or the ink that can be revealed only with fire. Things like this that just make sense to the world around it. The show instead decides to change this, making the OMASHU delivery system an invention by a non-bender. Now, what ist would I used here? Bender-ist? I'm not prejudiced against non-benders in saying that they can't come up with ideas only benders can implement, but that would imply that the delivery system couldn't have been made before Sai. While in the cartoon, they were around for at least 100 years before Aang arrives with Team Avatar. Something primal that just made sense even before the industrialization of the world began. I think this show is trying to use this as an example to the audience that Sai is a great inventor, like how the cartoon had tons of inventions that he created. So I'm not knocking him as a creator, I'm just talking about it being in this specific place, because it matches our episode lesson. If they had taken the time to maybe pad out a bit more of Sai's inventions, they maybe could have saved the delivery system from being a, how old is Sai? Less than 40-year-old invention, I guess. Which also answers the question of why the hell is Sai here in the first place? He had nothing to do with OMASHU in the cartoon, but he's here in the show. And the reason is because I think they wanted to shove as many miscellaneous ideas that people remember from the cartoon into the show, and this is the best idea they came up with. Or it's the one that stuck, at least. I don't know if it's the best. And the part that pisses me off in relation to it is that the show tries to shove in these notes to expand the world building.
OMASHU was carved out of a living mountain.
Excuse me? What the fuck does that even mean? There's no such thing as a living mountain. And who carved it? You can't just throw this shit in here and try to make us think your world is more developed than it is. Stop trying to trick me. Let's move on. Teo and his gliding were a result of both Sai's genius and the airbending culture that they found at the Northern Air Temple. And having them both exist outside of that environment just kind of robs them of the interesting aspects of their character. Or it would, if they didn't just transplant those ideas onto them with no respect for the new environment it placed them in. The access to Aang's culture also allowed them to create a replacement glider for him once his original one gets destroyed in book 3. So everyone remember I mentioned it when when they give Aang his new glider in season 3, because when I get mad that Teo and Sai shouldn't know how to do that, you'll know why. Who am I fucking kidding? They're not giving him a new glider. We'll keep talking about how some added length would have helped the story as it comes up, but as for now, let's head back to the beginning of the episode and try to go in order. Remember how I said OMASHU is a failure of understanding world building? Well, the dissenting Fire Nation citizens are another example of that. Query: what is the average age of a dissenting Fire Nation citizen in the cartoon? Let's call upon some prominent examples. Zhang Zhang is old as dirt. Xiaoyu, the Fire Nation sage, is maybe 40s? Old enough to have wrinkles, at least. The Fire Nation citizen who vouches for Sokka when Jet tries to drown their village is old enough to walk with a cane. And everyone's favorite old guy, Iroh of the Fire Nation, has got to be like 60s or 70s or something? Are we detecting a pattern yet? So let's put our thinking caps on and think about why all of the Fire Nation dissenters are old. Could it be because they maybe remember a different way of life? Could it be because maybe they're old enough to see through the propaganda and the indoctrination? Wait a second, did you say indoctrination? We actually do get a lot of examples of very young Fire Nation citizens in Book 3, and even though they're generally very repressed, none of them are traitors. You see, when you indoctrinate children at a young age, you grow them into adults who believe the same thing. Zhang Zhang definitely wasn't in school during the indoctrination period of the war. Same with Iroh. It was extremely subtle world building that, you know, made sense. So tell me why everyone who plans to assassinate Fire Lord Ozai in the show is a child. It's another huge swing and a miss as far as world building goes. I suppose they made them children so Azula could sneak in and disrupt them, but it feels strange to me. Continuing on, Ozai tells them, "Do not speak of me of loss." And I would like more clarity on what he means. Is he implying that he misses Zuko? Because if so, that shit is super weird compared to the cartoon. If he means something else, I guess we'll wait and see. But if Ozai misses Zuko, it places him in an interesting situation, especially with Azula. In the show, he is super manipulative towards Azula. Like, super outwardly manipulative. In the cartoon, he definitely was, but it was in more subtle ways. And definitely not to the extent it was with Zuko. But in the show, it almost seems 50-50. I think they made this change because they wanted more examples to show that Fire Lord Ozai is a bad dude, or that he wasn't playing favorites between Azula and Zuko, which,
My father says she was born lucky. He says I was lucky to be born.
He definitely was playing favorites in the cartoon, and it worked, so I don't know why they made this change. You can play the connect the strings game where you try to explain that he's pretending to like Zuko so that he can manipulate Azula to contact Zhao and kill the Avatar, but if you're gonna play that game, I will ask, what exactly is Ozai's motivation? In the cartoon, he knew that the Avatar was a nuisance, but he literally never changed any of his plans because of him. Bro was ready to use the comet to burn down the Earth Kingdom without even a thought about what the Avatar had to say about it. Everything involving Ozai just kind of confuses me. Speaking of confusing, why is Azula in the story exactly? In the cartoon, she only joins the story when Zhao is taken out of it, and she's actually able to add some action to the story. You'll see in later episodes, but this bitch doesn't even leave the palace. Why have her in the story at all? Well, I think the answer is just, unfortunately, name recognition. Remember Azula? Yeah, you do. Here she is. Remember her friends Mei and Ty Lee? Yeah, you do. Here she is. Remember Ozai? Well, hold on to your fucking seats. It feels lazy to me, but, you know, it's not my story. Moving right along. Do you realize how hard it is to shoot something out of the air? With a projectile, no less? Hitting a moving target is hard. Shooting a moving target is harder. And shooting a moving target with a moving target is insanely difficult, especially with little to no experience. Especially since she only learned how to do that like 10 fucking minutes ago. Girl's ready to fight Azula with Zuko already, goddamn. I know I mentioned it, but tapping into emotions as a source of bending is a bad idea, and one that was entirely missed from the cartoon. I mean, it wasn't directly talked about at least. So why do it? I am kind of past the point of being polite about it. I think the creators of the show didn't watch the cartoon as closely as I would have liked to avoid these mistakes. Oh, and yeah, Aang isn't training waterbending. Quick quiz for you all. The cartoon isn't divided into seasons, they're divided into books, right? Book 2 is Earth, Book 3 is Fire, so what is Book 1 called? We have A, water, B, change, C, CA, it's water, it's fucking water. Why isn't Aang learning how to waterbend? Okay, let me calm down. In fairness, Aang waterbends for the first time in the cartoon when him and Katara get the waterbending scroll, which is episode 9 out of 20, almost halfway through the season. So what's the context? Well, Aang didn't really have the motivation to learn all 4 elements until he unlocked his ticking clock, defeat the Fire Lord by the end of the summer. This happened an episode before, in episode 8. Before that, they knew they needed to reach the North Pole, but were more so taking their time doing it. In contrast, the show has spent a full 3 episodes out of 8 not learning waterbending. So if we go one more episode without him learning, we'll be about on pace. But they haven't even talked about Roku or the ticking clock yet. And to add to that, Katara had the waterbending scroll the entire time, so she should have been teaching him this episode since she was learning herself. So why? Well, going by the numbers, we're not quite behind schedule yet. The cartoon was content on letting Aang put off waterbending since they were establishing the world and characters, and my guess would be that the creators of the show thought the same thing. I really don't need to be making that big of a deal out of it yet, but it feels so much more condensed because it's only 8 episodes, you know? And if we think about the timeline of when she got the scroll, he started learning immediately after that, and she had the scroll the whole time, so why wasn't she teaching him? We are kind of behind if we look at it like that. Also in the conversation,
the monks always said I never listened. I think that's what they said. I never listened.
I mentioned it before, but in the cartoon it just never had moments like this. The conversation about heading to the North Pole is insinuating that Katara would get to learn from a master, but the show literally, and frustratingly, never mentions that Katara should learn waterbending from a master. It has always been about Aang. I think the show just kind of implies that she would be learning the skill by herself. Self-teach that shit, YouTube it. I know for sure I've mentioned it before, Aang's attitude of
"we can learn it together"
is fucking gone, and it makes me sad. Moving on, Team Avatar just stumbles upon OMASHU.
Look, it's the Great Divide!
In the cartoon, it was a choice, and another reinforcing idea that Aang is just a kid who wants to goof around more than he wants to be the Avatar. We can add it to our pile of reinforced ideas about removing agency for our characters. It seems like things happen to our characters, not by our characters. There's a difference in those two. Next, I actually have some positive stuff to say about the show. It's in the scene where Iroh, Zuko, and Zhao talk about Aang's journey and his relation to the Fire Nation forces that are more northern. I don't actually recall a scene in the cartoon where they talk about the world on such a large scale like this. It's actually one of the weaknesses in my opinion. We know that the Fire Nation islands are west of the world, we know that Ba Sing Se is northeast in the Earth Kingdom, and we know that the northern air temples are defined by north, south, east, and west, but that was kind of all the info we got, and I know it's not an uncommon thought that people wish there was a map Team Avatar would occasionally look at or flash to so that they can track Aang's journey step by step. So I will absolutely congratulate the show when it does something like this. I really don't hate the show, I just wish it was better. And hey, this is adding points for me. Good job. Speaking of good jobs, let's actually add another new idea. Heartthrob, or Jet I guess, says they don't take kindly to strangers in OMASHU. And so the new idea that the show wants to explore is isolationism. Now the cartoon had its 4 nations, yes, and they were separate from each other, but they were never really like isolationists. Take OMASHU as a direct comparison. They were fine with letting in outsiders. The isolationism continues into arresting Aang at the end of the episode, which I'm going to assume is due to their policies, since Bro was trying to put the fires out. The cartoon just had much more of a everyone is against the Fire Nation vibe going for it, so yeah, new idea unlocked. Next, Azula being salty about Ozai's words towards Zuko. We're done with the good, aren't we? Firstly, Ozai wasn't impressed that Zuko found the Avatar. His objective was to capture him, so in the cartoon, Ozai doesn't give a shit about Zuko's accomplishment, which makes Azula's saltiness null in the cartoon. The fact that she's throwing a fit about it just kind of hurts her character in my opinion. In the cartoon, she was way more affected by her mother than her father. She related and looked up to her dad, and he thought extremely fondly of her back. Now let's talk about her entourage. Pop quiz. Why did Azula seek out Ty Lee in the cartoon? Well, it's because of the incompetence of the Fire Nation. Remember,
we're taking the prisoners home!
Bro had one job. Since she was tasked by her father to find Zuko and Iroh, she needed people that she could trust, and that's why she found Ty Lee. I don't even know why Ty Lee is here in the capital city, to be honest. Shouldn't she have run away at this point? Oh Jesus, I just realized they're not gonna have her run away, which means they're not gonna have a beach episode. Oh, fuck. That's literally the best episode. So why change it? Because of the same, hey, remember Ty Lee thing that I mentioned from earlier. This shit is basically just fan service. I want to talk briefly about the bombing.
Of course, yeah. Thoughts and prayers.
Thoughts and prayers.
In the cartoon, it was extremely uncommon for anything resembling an actual bomb to go off in the show, instead replaced with different unique types of bombs. This ties in a little bit to the part I mentioned about Smellerby using actual daggers to fight a Fire Nation spy. That bit I mentioned about the limitations of the network. There's actually a few documentaries about Avatar: The Last Airbender, and something the creators talked about is how the studio heads loved the idea of bending, because it allowed the characters to actually fight each other in a way that seemed less dangerous than it actually was. No one actually needed to get stabbed or knifed or exploded. Instead, they got slammed by air, water, earth, and it only seemed deadly when it was meant to be. The limitations of the network allowed the show to be more creative with its fighting, but since Netflix's adaptation was opting for a more realistic telling of this story, they don't need to live with these same limitations, and they can just allow characters to actually get stabbed, I guess. I think that's a huge missed opportunity for creativity, but not my show. While we're talking about that fight, let's talk more about Jet. Why is he here? I point again to fan service, but also the theme of the episode. They didn't want to take their time actually giving him his own story, so they just mixed him in with the Mechanist. I think that's also why Jet and his freedom fighters don't go hand in hand. They're almost separate entities of each other. The freedom fighters almost feel like an afterthought, especially their base. The idea of a treehouse base worked on so many levels. For one, it helped answer the question of why can't the Fire Nation find them? For two, they're fucking children. Of course they pulled a codename Kid Next Door. I guess they kind of just forgot that fact for the show, but yeah, Jet is like the same age as Zuko. And the base being on the ground in the show really makes me think that they didn't actually consider the role that the freedom fighters were going to have on the story. Remember when we saw Andor shoot a dude in the beginning of Rogue One and we all had this thought of like, oh fuck, that's right, good guys can be bad guys and still be good guys. Well, Jet did that for Avatar: The Last Airbender in a way that was actually more subtle in a cartoon for children than in a show for adults. Continuing on, Katara and Jet's conversation is nothing special except this one line she has.
I still don't understand what firebenders are doing in the Earth Kingdom city.
Guys, this is literally the most expository thing I've ever heard. Don't let them get away with this. There is no reason that Katara would ask a question like this. Katara, the one whose family and water tribe was attacked by the Fire Nation. She doesn't ask, wait, why does the Fire Nation occupy that town you're going to flood in the cartoon? It's bad writing, and just because it's not a significant scene or moment doesn't mean they should get away with it. Call it out when you see it. If you see something, say something. To offer actual analysis, Katara and Sokka in the cartoons are the ones constantly explaining this to Aang, who takes a little while to grasp the idea that the Fire Nation could do such a thing. So why is it different? Because the show literally just wants to exposit to you and doesn't care how it's done. I've already gone over that the Netflix executives probably told the writers that this episode wasn't second screen enough, and thus this line was born for anybody who didn't actually see the explosion, or the fight, or any of the context of what's happening. While we're talking about it, it's also super interesting that the show has to get super handholdy while having Jet explain that he's the good guy, and then Katara clarify that he's the bad guy, while also simultaneously having the Fire Lord burn dudes alive. I'm sorry, I thought we were trying to make the show more adult. So what, we're making this for adults who can't follow a story as simple as somebody being an anti-hero? The show is caught between wanting to tell a more adult version of Avatar, but also wanting to cater to the underclass of viewers who don't even watch your show. If you wanted to be more adult, you should have just committed to it. And if people miss it, well, sucks to be them. Watch it again and pay attention this time, for fuck's sake. Imagine how different Breaking Bad would have been if they only catered to people who didn't actually watch the show. Grow up a little. Be confused. If you miss something, just watch it again. Okay, sorry, moving on. Hakoda's character assassination will be much more relevant to talk about in later episodes, so I guess I'll save it for then. But that's why they started this change here. It's because they're building up to an arc about Sokka overcoming his childhood trauma. Instead of talking about a cartoon parallel that doesn't exist, let's talk about the beginning of an actual character arc for Sokka, his self-confidence. This is actually one taken from the cartoon at various places. Sokka's identity has often come into question, whether he's the boomerang guy, the meat and sarcasm guy, or the sword guy. He's had to fight to prove that he belongs traveling side by side with Team Avatar. But damn man, throughout 3 books, he surely does. But in book 1, especially with it being his first time outside of his tribe, there's a lot of growing pains that go into that, whether it's with Katara or Jet or just his own instincts. So it actually is like the single most natural thing for them to want to adapt to the Netflix show. Well done. I'm sure that they won't betray the original cartoon or arc whatsoever. It does make me actually realize that they are really struggling with starting up character arcs, huh? Sokka's in episode 3, and he's kind of the only one we have to work with here. Aang's arc about accepting that he's the Avatar was kind of already resolved, and compared to the cartoon where he only truly gets closure on that in The Storm, episode 12, he did it remarkably fast. Katara's arc was much more about finding her own power and strength, for book 1 at least. There were tons and tons of smaller arcs for our cartoon characters to go through, whether it was learning how to get along, divide up duties, who handles money, how to pick and choose your battles. It's what made these characters so well-rounded. And I think what was the most crucial part about their journeys is that they were all doing it together. It wasn't Katara meets Jet, it was Team Avatar meets Jet. It wasn't Aang and Teo get to solve a mystery together, and Sokka gets to know the Mechanist. It was Team Avatar explores the Northern Air Temple. These kids did everything together, and it was extremely rare that they split up. In book 1, the first time that they actually do that is episode 13, The Blue Spirit. And that's after the episode where Katara gets captured and thrown into prison. Like, these kids were inseparable. And I think the reason why the show decided to split them up so heavily is back to our main theme of length again. They just needed to cover so much ground that there was no way to have Team Avatar stay together throughout all of it. The super convoluted misunderstanding between Team Avatar could all have been avoided if they took these adventures together instead of separately. How is Sokka supposed to have feelings about Jet without actually meeting the fucker? It feels super out of place. Even after this confrontation, Aang splits up against Zuko again. The show is just allergic to having these kids stick together. He often fought Zuko without Sokka and Katara since he was the only master against a dangerous opponent. But I don't think it's in the nature of Katara and Sokka from the cartoon to just leave Aang to fight a dangerous opponent by himself. There always seemed to be a group fight that allowed Sokka and Katara to be useful while Aang fought the hardest opponent, like in Bato of the Water Tribe, when Sokka and Katara found a way to outsmart June and Nyla, leaving Aang to deal with Zuko. That fight is awesome, by the way. You should rewatch it. So let's quickly switch again to Azula. Remember how everyone thought the Star Wars prequels were boring because they had Senate scenes? Politics slow the story down. Now that's not always a bad thing, especially in complicated stories with a lot of different factions and players. But with Avatar, they always kept politics to a minimum because they were able to communicate the intention behind them in different ways. With that preamble, someone tell me why they have Azula shadow controlling Zhao for this part of the story. This is like the 9th time I've caught them removing agency from one of our characters, and now it's affecting Zhao. Bro never needed help in the cartoon. He got a promotion from the Fire Lord himself for just being a good general. But now he's going to be influenced by Azula, and that's just saddening to me. Okay, those are the major points, so let's wrap up with some miscellaneous stuff. I feel like the Jet episode in the cartoon has beautiful stylization between the explanation of Sokka's story near the end to the color work done for Katara and Jet, and that kind of heart and passion just feels like it's missing, and it makes me sad. Speaking of making me sad, here's another example of Aang using the Force to lift up the plates during his fight with Zuko. I am not going to let go of this. Airbending is not telekinesis. He must use his entire body to bend, that's the rule. Oh, what's that? You dare to point to this example of Bumi lifting up a lot of rocks at one time and hitting them one at a time? My brother in Christ, earthbending is different than airbending. Airbending is fluid, it breathes. Earthbending is stoic and unmovable. Also, Bumi is as old as Aang and has been earthbending for every day of his life for the last 112 years. Give it to him, okay? Katara seems to relearn the same stance like 4 times in the show. I don't know how to more accurately explain this, but it looks like she keeps doing the same movements when she waterbends. Imagine it in a video game. I feel like I'm seeing the same animation for everything. The show seems to use the word warrior a lot. We'll have to keep note of that, but Sokka, Zuko, and Jet all use it. Specific words get used a lot in Avatar, like destiny, for instance.
Destiny.
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 Destiny. Destiny. Destiny.
Destiny.
Destiny.
Destiny.
so it's not unusual. We'll just keep an eye on it and see if it does anything. And finally, a miscellaneous note that I can praise for the show. The Cabbage Merchant makes his first appearance in this episode, and as far as fan service goes, despite this episode being riddled with it, he of all people is the example of doing this right.
My cabbages!
Is one of the most iconic ongoing jokes of the show, and to have him come out right out and say it the first time we saw him would have been obvious. Instead, dude pops up like 3 or 4 times before we actually let him get it out. It's actually really well done as far as subverting expectations for this recurring joke. I'm giving a genuine hats off to you for that one. Take it, show. You've earned it. This episode starts with Aang in the OMASHU prison with Uncle Iroh in the cell next to him. Aang does get imprisoned in his time in OMASHU in episode 5. But the chambers he gets taken to were newly refurbished, so it's absolutely nothing like this. Other than that, Aang and Iroh's conversation is exclusive to the show, as these two only talk for the first time in Crossroads of Destiny in Book 2. I know I've mentioned it before. Sokka questioning Sai about his involvement with the Fire Nation is exclusive to the show. After Aang, Teo, and Katara discover his stash of weapons at the Northern Air Temple, it's Teo who's most disappointed in him. The conversation is mostly between father and son. Katara informs them that Aang is in prison, but in the cartoon she was present with Aang in prison, so there's no equivalency to be drawn here. Zuko possibly kills an Earth Kingdom soldier and takes his outfit so he can disguise himself. This is exclusive to the show, as Zuko never goes undercover as an Earth Kingdom soldier. Next is the flashback to Aang with Bumi 100 years ago. This happens in episode 5, but the content is entirely different. In the cartoon, Bumi doesn't even mention that he's an Earthbender, and him and Aang just talk about how the mail delivery system in the right hands could be the world's greatest superslide. Bumi carving the bison whistle is a detail exclusive to the show. Aang does have a bison whistle in the cartoon, but he gets it in episode 9, the same episode where they get the waterbending scroll. Also, another detail is that Gyatso is not in the cartoon flashback at all, but he's standing right behind Aang as a chaperone in the show. Actually, it's a pretty cool detail. Iroh continues his talk with Aang, appreciating some of the masonry of the Earth Kingdom. In the cartoon, his appreciation for the other nations came out during the boat ride to Ba Sing Se, and also at various points throughout the cartoon. Because Aang and Iroh never actually have a conversation together before the end of Book 2, the idea that Aang poses about asking Iroh to make Zuko see that his quest is pointless is one that's exclusive to the show. But it is kind of interesting, and I'd say it could have some roots set in the conversation that Zuko and Aang have when he's revealed as the Blue Spirit, but I'll get to that soon enough. Sai tells Team Avatar minus Aang that the only way to get into the palace is through the secret tunnels through the mountains. Secret tunnels. In the cartoon, they're all captured together, so getting into the palace isn't something they have to consider. Iroh exposits all over the audience that the pit is for prisoners of war and no one has ever been heard from who goes there. Ooh, spooky. So now this does have some cartoon roots, but the circumstances are rather different. During episode 7, The Spirit World, Iroh is captured by Earth Kingdom soldiers as he relaxes in a hot spring. They plan to have him stand trial in Ba Sing Se, though. The pit, specifically, is exclusive to the show. Matter of fact, we don't actually get to see any kind of Earth Kingdom labor camps in the cartoon. All of those belong exclusively to the Fire Nation, and we do see several of those. Anyway, they then tell Aang that he's going to visit the king. In the cartoon, they immediately take him to the king, and the holding cells are only after he meets him. So because the order is changed, no one ever tells Aang that he's going to meet the king. Sai's Fire Nation contact attempts to get in touch with him via a knifegram. The Mechanist only directly talks to one Fire Nation general in the cartoon, when he comes to collect the war balloon. It's not sneaky, and Aang is even present, so the circumstances are rather different. Now, Aang meeting King Bumi for the first time. To get really in the weeds, in the show, his crimes are fighting, destroying property, and menacing the people. In the cartoon, his crimes are vandalism, traveling under false pretenses, and malicious destruction of cabbages.
Off with their heads! One for each head of cabbage!
The guard also mentions that Bumi requested him, but in the cartoon, he didn't request him. Aang broke the rules and had to meet the king. The guard also mentions that he's an airbender, and Bumi, a moment later, claps back that he's not just an airbender, he's the Avatar. In the cartoon, this entire sequence is a little scrambled. Upon hearing their crimes, Bumi announces that he'll throw them a feast. At the feast, he throws a chicken leg at Aang, who catches it with his airbending. Bumi then pieces together that he must be the Avatar as well. The show then continues by having Bumi snort, and Aang immediately recognizes him as his old friend. The cartoon saves this as the reveal of the entire episode, turning it into a really beautiful moment. The show changes this and doesn't even let Aang hug his old friend. How rude. Bumi in the show asks Aang how he's still alive, but the cartoon skips this question, instead making it a joke. Bumi has this diva moment where he spits out the tea that he told them to prepare, and Aang rightfully points out that it's his own fault. Bumi uses this specifically as a motivation to throw him a feast. The cartoon doesn't have this moment. It makes Bumi a bit loony, but he was never aggressive or a diva. His jokes were mostly contained to himself, and the cartoon uses, you know, the crimes he actually committed as an excuse to throw him a feast instead. The show now returns to Katara getting her combat water sling. This is actually really neat, and I never had to think about it before now. The cartoon doesn't give this sling any kind of introduction whatsoever. She has it in episode 10, Jet, and as far as I can tell, this is the first appearance of it, as she doesn't have it when she fights the pirates in episode 9. In the show, she's interrupted by Jet, and the conversation they have is kind of similar similar to the last conversation they have with Jet in Book 1. The surrounding circumstances are all different since he was trying to destroy a town, not do an assassination. There's some overlap in the conversation, like when Jet invokes Katara's mother as a reason for her fighting back, but it takes a pretty sharp departure because Jet kinda kidnaps Sokka in the cartoon, so that becomes the focus. The conversation they have is more about Katara's feelings about the situation and less about Jet's worldview. The conversation in both mediums ends with Katara waterbending at Jet, and then using a never-before-seen ability, in both mediums, where she freezes the water with her breath. Jet tries to take credit for her power, and she snaps back by saying that her power is her own. The cartoon was absolutely feminist, and has some incredible storytelling moments about that, but nothing quite as, what's the word, obvious as this? Zuko sneaking around in disguise is again a show exclusive. Now we go back and begin the feast. Bumi turns this into a test to see if he's really the Aang he remembers, which I'm not gonna make a folder for, but it is a unique idea that the show has that the cartoon was missing. That's probably because Bumi is the only friend that Aang has from 100 years ago. He offers him some short ribs from Kangaroo Island.
I hear that place is really hopping.
Yeah, it is actually a joke taken from the cartoon, except it's Aang who tries to lie and say that he's from Kangaroo Island to hide his identity. Aang says that he doesn't eat meat, which is again a detail taken from the cartoon. Not from any specific point, just an ongoing thing. The feast in the cartoon is a shorter scene with its purpose specifically being to reveal that Aang was an airbender. However, the show takes this opportunity to make Bumi spiteful? Angry? He makes jokes at Aang's expense in regards to him being gone for 100 years. He addresses that Aang has been missing when they talk to him at the end of the episode, but it was never like this in the cartoon. Bumi is consistently a friendly presence for Aang. Like, Bumi fucking yawns at Aang when he says that there's a tragedy coming for the North Pole. This is not the Bumi from the cartoon. Bumi's lettuce leaf pun is from the cartoon as well, but it's, well, not as forced as in the show. He says it as a response to Sokka instead of it being unprompted. Aang asks Bumi if he cares, which wasn't in the cartoon because Bumi very visibly cared, even if it seemed like he was wasting their time. The show uses this as an opportunity to have Bumi do a little recounting of what fighting the same war for 100 years is like, which again is missing from the cartoon, and I really like it, so I'll be returning to this conversation shortly. Just know that it's not at all how Bumi was in the cartoon. At his worst, he was frivolous and wasteful of their time. The conversation ends with Aang challenging Bumi to prove to him that he's lost hope. It's a little convoluted, but it's what begins our challenges. I'll have to talk about it in a bit anyway, so let's get this out of the way now. Bumi's challenges in the cartoon were trying to hint to Aang that all is not quite as it seems, and he'll have to use more than just his bending abilities to defeat the Fire Lord, especially because the king wasn't revealed as Bumi yet, so the challenges were pointing Aang at trying to identify his old friend. And he wanted to show Aang that the world is different and he'll have to think differently. So the cartoon has it as a lesson, the show has it as spite, I guess? I don't know. Now, we get to the opening of the tunnels of OMASHU. These tunnels are officially called the Cave of Two Lovers, which is episode 2 of Book 2. So aside from Azula's involvement, this is the first real journey that the show is taking from Book 2. Sokka and Katara find the nomads in the cave singing to themselves, but in the cartoon, Team Avatar takes a minute to stop and rest at a river when the nomads come upon them. Team Avatar is kind of forced to take the tunnels despite the treachery because there is a Fire Nation blockade preventing them from flying. And yes, Aang is with them for this journey. Another example of how the show needlessly splits up our characters. Sokka and Katara get to see the tale of two lovers from the nomads. This tale is from the cartoon, but it's Katara and Aang who find it, by themselves, not the entire group. It gives them the idea that love may lead the way. It's hella deep in the caves, behind a door that has to be busted open by Appa, in fact, guarding their tombs, not just at the entrance to the tunnels. Now, let's get really specific about these stories. The show instantly gives away that the two lovers were named Oma and Shu. The cartoon saves this reveal for the very end of the story, allowing it to be a reveal. But after that first sentence, the tales are remarkably similar. Like, other than a word or two, exactly the same. In the show, wait a sec, gotta double check this. Yep, those are she, her pronouns. Okay, yeah, so in the cartoon, since the reveal that their names were Oma and Shu wasn't until the end, Katara just calls them the man and the woman. So it made me a little confused when in the show, the nomad says that Oma died, she'd been killed in an attack, and Shu wielded her earthbending power to stop the fighting. Y'all, they made OMASHU gay, hell yeah. Anyway, the story continues being exactly the same up until the end, even with the nomad reading Love is Brightest in the Dark, and Katara saying the same exact thing after the story. Very impressed, well done. It should be noted that in the cartoon, the mantra is plated between a statue of the two kissing, and in the show it's just at the entrance to the tunnels. Before heading in, Sokka says there's no such thing as angry spirits, which is amusing for this point in the story, but it wouldn't be something he'd be able to say in the cartoon. By book 2, Sokka would have been taken to the spirit world, so any question about if the spirits existed would have definitely been put to rest. However, it doesn't break anything for the show since he hasn't seen any spirit world shenanigans yet. So it's actually a pretty good joke that doesn't disrupt anything. I approve. The scene ends with the nomads reprising the ever iconic Secret Tunnel song. I think it sounds pretty good for what it is. I should also note that the nomad group is 4 people big in the show, but 5 people big in the cartoon. They also don't go with Sokka and Katara in the show, but they all travel together in the cartoon. Now we go back to Iroh being transported by earthbenders to the pit. He comments about having such a large escort, which is funny because in the cartoon it was only 5 dudes. One of the Earth Kingdom soldiers comes over to taunt Iroh, calling him the Dragon of the West. The soldiers do call him that in the cartoon, but it's when they first capture him, rather than during a break in their journey. The soldier punching Iroh is exclusive to the show, however.
You may be eligible to receive compensation.
Iroh Iroh and the soldiers have a few scattered interactions, but none quite as hostile as this. The soldiers are very respectful of Iroh in the cartoon. This interaction in the show is to allow Iroh to drop his pie show tile and allow Zuko to continue tracking him. But in the cartoon, he was bathing when he was captured and doesn't have a sleeve to hide the tile in, and instead fakes falling asleep so he can leave behind his slipper. Next, Bumi's first challenge game, whatever. Aang steps onto a booby trap and unleashes a mountain of genomite. So this is a reference to the creeping crystal rings that Bumi gave Team Avatar in the cartoon. It was an insurance policy for Aang to finish the games, and the reveal that they had been rock candy was at the end of the episode meant to be a they're actually kind of harmless note, rather than a wow, he's fucking crazy kind of note. The key to this challenge is, watch where you step, I guess? The lesson being that there are apparently no easy journeys for the Avatar. Okay. The cartoon's first challenge was very, very different. Bumi put a key inside a waterfall and asked Aang to retrieve it. He tried tackling it head on, but instead had to use some finesse and strategic thinking to give the key to Bumi. The lesson didn't come at the end of the first challenge, but at the end of all the challenges. The lesson being that he had to think about all of the challenges in a unique way, as they weren't what he thought they'd be. Zuko now gains on his uncle, finding the pie show tile. In the cartoon, he's on a rhino, not on foot, and he smells the slipper to confirm it's his uncle's, lol. But nearly the same scene given the context. Now we go back to Sokka and Katara wandering the caves. We run through a lot of references to the cartoon really quickly, so let's take them one at a time. Show Sokka has a map, which he only started to construct after wandering the caves a little bit without them in the cartoon. He then ignores the map for his instincts, which was the problem of the week with Team Avatar for episode 10. The show just kind of brushes this off, but it was a larger conflict for everyone in the cartoon. Next, Sokka notices some crystals and blows out the torches to reveal the crystals embedded in the tunnels. That's also from the Cave of Two Lovers, but Sokka never got to see them for himself, only Katara and Aang, and they got to see them by accident because their torch ran out, not by choice. Sokka takes credit for uncovering the clue in the show, but it's Katara who points this out in the cartoon. They then fight about a show exclusive topic, Sokka not taking Katara seriously. Sokka and Katara always had a sibling tension to them, but they always had each other's backs, and I think it was extremely rare in a high-risk situation like this that the two would be fighting. Then Sokka yells that Dad put him in charge, and Katara yells that he's not his dad, widening our Sokka's insecurity character arc folder. We'll talk about it next section though. And back to Iroh. This time Iroh gets lectured by the same soldier about how he lost his brother in Ba Sing Se. Iroh fucking dunks on him, and the soldier nearly crushes him with a rock, prompting Iroh to remember all that he's lost. But before we go there, the second encounter between Iroh and the soldiers in the cartoon is when he tries to bust himself out. He complains about his shackles, they adjust them, Iroh torches his hand, shoots fire at the ostrich horses, and then rolls down a hill. Doesn't even suffer a scratch until they catch him. And the conversation is basically non-existent. So while there are two distinct interactions between everyone in both mediums, they couldn't really be farther from similar. Now, the flashback of Iroh at Liu Ten's funeral. This scene is a show exclusive. No scene like this existed in the cartoon. Well, no scene exactly like this. In episode 9 of book 2, after Azula shoots Iroh, he has dreams of Liu Ten, and we see him on a hill mourning him, but that's all I can pull from. Zuko being empathetic about Liu Ten as a person rather than a soldier is actually from the cartoon though. As Azula taunts Iroh for being a failure, Zuko says that he probably just misses his son. That happens in episode 7 of book 2. The scene caps off with the instrumental for Leaves from the Vine, which was the song Iroh sang at the memorial of Liu Ten from the Tales of Ba Sing Se. Beautiful. Now back to Sokka and Katara. Like, literally every element of this conversation is exclusive to the show. Sokka compliments Katara's growing skills, she talks about how Jet lost family, about how the Mechanist lost family, apologizes for not respecting Sokka's leadership, and most importantly, that the crystals were random. The crystals in the cartoon were the way to navigate the... Yeah? Tell him what you mean. The crystals in the cartoon were the way to navigate the tunnels, no questions about it. The show instead uses them as a way to show that Katara's instincts are better than Sokka's, I guess. As they try to backtrack, they discover that the tunnels are changing, which is a beat that they all discover in the cartoon, although it's pretty close to the beginning of their journey. Bumi shows Aang the door to his next challenge, and Aang challenges that the fun-loving Bumi is still inside the cold, calloused one. We've talked about it enough, you get the picture that this isn't Bumi from the cartoon. Bumi's final test is a fight between the two of them, but before we get to that, there's actually a second challenge that the show is missing. In the cartoon, there's 3 challenges. Retrieve the lunchbox key is number 1, a duel is number 3, but number 2 is to retrieve Bumi's pet Flopsy. The challenge is to show Aang that not everything is as dangerous as it looks, and he'll have to think outside the box, same as the others. But this challenge was omitted from the show, so I guess it's not that relevant. I just felt the need to mention that the challenge portion of this episode should have been about 33% longer. Now, in the cartoon, challenge 3 was a duel between Aang and a duelist of his choosing, and he picked Bumi because it was the unexpected choice, as opposed to the scary-looking dudes. In the show, he just rips off his robe. Oh no, he's hot! And tells Aang that they're gonna fight to the death. Before that though, Sokka and Katara come face to face with the Badger Mole. Before that though, if a burning tree falls in the forest and no Earth Kingdom soldiers are around to see it, does Zuko still save his uncle? Well, the cartoon never had to answer this question, since after Iroh's recapture, the Earth Kingdom soldiers plan to crush his hands as punishment, and Zuko intervenes and breaks his chains, making it a 2v5. The show omits this punishment, as it omitted the escape. Oh, but Zuko does do the same hammer kick to break the chains in both versions, so that's cool. Nothing really to say about this fight except that they don't have any comment about being outmatched, and Iroh uses the chains to destroy the rocks in both versions again, so that's pretty cool. At the end of the fight, Iroh spares an Earth Kingdom soldier, and he retaliates by bending a knife-shaped rock into Iroh's back.
Do I take it out or do I leave it in?
in? Do I take it out or do I leave it in?
The badger mole grabs Sokka's leg and Katara whips it with some water in the show. In the cartoon, Katara never sees a badger mole. She escapes the cave with Aang by following the very much working crystals. Sokka does see the badger moles, but in cowering accidentally plucks a string on the guitar, and him and the nomads notice they're music lovers. The nomads didn't come into the cave with them, so I can't wait to see how Sokka and Katara get out of this one. Wait, the power of love? Brotherly love? Is this Alabama? Katara notes that the badger moles are blind, which is a detail revealed in the Earth book. In the show, Katara then says that they can sense emotion. Which, no? Why would they be able to do that? I mean, yeah, it's a fantasy world, but what part of big giant blind earthbending mole makes you think that they can sense emotion? Even better, Sokka just asks the badger moles to take them to the palace. Why are the tunnels even deadly if the badger moles are just that easy to talk to? What the hell? This is obviously not something that happens in the cartoon. Sokka and the nomads tame the badger moles and they help them escape the tunnels. And to clarify, the tunnels were used to navigate from the river to OMASHU. They did not lead into the palace. Don't know if I mentioned that before, because, you know, it would be a rather large inconsistency if OMASHU was made after Oma and Shu died and their tunnels lead to the fucking palace. Good thing the cartoon didn't have to deal with that question though. And now Bumi tries to kill the Avatar. Some of the choreography matches, most of it doesn't. I'll talk a little bit more about it in the next section, so here's a quick match cut of some of the same moves that are in both mediums while Corbin tells us a story. Thanks, Corbin. The fight concludes differently in both mediums. In the cartoon, Aang actually gets the best of Bumi and has him at gunpoint, or staff point, until it's revealed that Bumi let it happen and is holding a big chunk of earth above them. He then tells Aang he's won and leaves to the balcony. In the show, it concludes with Bumi basically saying you'll have to kill me or save yourself, with a huge chunk of rock over him. This comes from his spite towards Aang and isn't found in the cartoon. Katara and Sokka get there just in time to get the king out of the way and allow Aang to save himself. This wouldn't have been possible in the cartoon because the two were imprisoned by the Genomai rings. Bumi calls Aang a cheater, which isn't necessary in the cartoon, and Aang tells him that relying on your friends isn't a bad thing. This was never expressly said in the cartoon, but as I've said, it's literally the glue holding the entire show together, so I'm glad it's being addressed at least. Aang also gives his "The Avatar is back" speech for like the 6th time in the show so far. The cartoon has Aang accept his role as Avatar like 3 or 4 times, for sure. It even lets episode 4 exist because Katara is trying to nurture and encourage that. So it's not bad, it's just different. We'll explain why shortly. For now, Team Avatar and Bumi go outside where it's revealed that Sai has alerted OMASHU to an attack by the Fire Nation, wrapping up his story. Again, nothing like this for the cartoon. And lastly, Bumi asks Aang to ride the mail cart with him. They do, and they crash into the cabbage merchant. All of that is actually the same as the cartoon, except it's Aang who asks Bumi. Iroh and Zuko getting on and off boats is exclusive to the show, just trying to set up for Zuko's departure and Iroh asking to join him. The flashback is also exclusive to the show, but hot damn is it cute. And it does actually have some of its sweetness taken from a moment in the cartoon. Iroh tells Zuko he has everything he needs, and he kinda deflects it by saying it's about the tea. He does the same thing in the cartoon. After Zuko finishes his Agni Kai with Zhao, and Iroh tells him that
even in exile, my nephew is more honorable than you. Thanks again for the tea. It was delicious.
And as they walk away, Zuko asks if he meant that, and Iroh again deflects, saying,
I told you ginseng tea is my favorite.
And back to the present. Zuko looks up to see Appa and Team Avatar departing, deciding to get Iroh back to the ship rather than pursuing. I mean, I don't know how he was going to track him anyway, he's on foot. This is actually taken from the cartoon though. When Zuko is tracking his uncle, as he's closing in, he notices Appa and Katara in the sky, deciding to pursue his uncle instead. The difference is that in the cartoon he's on a rhino, so pursuit would actually be possible, as opposed to the show where he's on a boat and really has no way of catching up to them. Let's talk about focus. Avatar: The Last Airbender had an episodic format, which, for anyone unaware, meant that each episode had a self-contained story, a beginning, middle, and end to every 22 minutes. The exceptions, of course, being episodes labeled Part 1 and Part 2, like The Winter Solstice, and of course, Sozin's Comet. The Netflix adaptation opts to make the show a mini-series, which isn't as important as noting that each episode is no longer episodic. Episode 3 leads directly in Episode 4, almost like you could remove the credit break between them and then they'd roll right into each other. This in and of itself isn't a problem, but when the content is an adaptation, it gets kind of messy. This episode is primarily taken from The Cave of Two Lovers, Book 2, Episode 2. But that's only the B story, because the A story is Aang's audience with King Bumi, Book 1, Episode 5. But the C story is Zuko saving his uncle, which is taken from Book 1, Episode 7. And it concludes the Mechanist story about the Fire Nation spies, taken from Book 1, Episode 17, while also concluding Jet's storyline, which is Book 1, Episode 10. For comparison, Episode 2 spent literally the entire episode on Kyoshi Island, which was Book 1, Episode 4. With this in mind, you can see how this episode is just unfocused. It's trying to spend so much time on so many different aspects, and you know the saying.
Never half-ass two things. Whole-ass one thing.
We basically pick right up where the last episode ends. Aang in prison and Sai being confronted by Sokka. The show's decision to put Sai in OMASHU is one I talked about last episode, and concluding it in this episode is just, you know, the natural end of it. I do have some things to say about the dialogue though. Firstly, Sai mentions that the only reason the Fire Nation hasn't attacked OMASHU is because he's feeding them information. This is actually transplanted from his episodes in the cartoon, because at the Northern Air Temple, he most definitely was the reason the Fire Nation wasn't attacking them. However, it doesn't work here since OMASHU isn't his settlement. It's its own Earth Kingdom stronghold. And I think this transplanted idea kind of cheapens the strength of the city in and of itself. He also says the Avatar is lost. And like, I can't think of an example in the cartoon where if Aang was captured, the people around him wouldn't be interested in rescuing him. He's the fucking Avatar. Even Zuko broke him out when Zhao imprisoned him. So why make that change then? Why make Sai say that the Avatar is lost? Well, I think this episode in general is trying to show a darker side of the Avatar world, especially with the stuff with Bumi. I'll talk about that in a minute. And so it's a good prelude to helping us feel like, wow, the entire world is over it, huh? This is also the first time I really want to address the title cards. The symbol behind the words are actually the same as the one for the last episode.
Keep an eye on that, it might be important.
I think the symbols might be representing a place, since the last episode and this episode all start in OMASHU. Although, and I only noticed this during editing, the symbol used behind OMASHU is actually the symbol for Earth in the cartoon. You can see it on the title cards. I don't know if it means anything, but it's cool to see the connection, I suppose. The next change I want to talk about is that Bumi crafts Aang's bison whistle instead of Aang buying it at a market. I think this change is kind of obvious to make. It's great to let Aang's kit be sentimental to him rather than something he just picked up. Let's talk about Katara's girl power scene with Jet.
Look at the power you have. That's because of me.
That wasn't you. That was me.
As I said before, the cartoon was already pretty feminist, but the difference is the nature in which they do it. The cartoon was feminist inherently. It didn't need to tell you she was powerful, it showed you. Every damn episode it showed you. The only moment I can think of where Katara got to be proud of her power was in the Southern Raiders episode. But the context was about her mother successfully hiding her power, so that she can show how strong she's become. Speaking of the cartoon doing things inherently better, let's look at the comparison to the dialogue. Iroh gets put in shackles and taken to the pit.
No one who's been sent there has ever been heard from again.
Now let's look at the destination from the cartoon. Iroh asks where he's going. Soldier says to face justice. Iroh asks where specifically, and the soldier says someplace you're familiar with.
You once laid siege to it for 600 days.
And Iroh finishes,
Ah, the great city of Ba Sing Se.
In the show, it's 1 line. In the cartoon, it's 5. The cartoon clocks this scene at 28 seconds, while the show has it for 48 seconds. Nearly double the time for what I consider a weaker version of communicating the same information. For the cartoon, it's just natural. It sounds like a normal conversation that two people would have, not an info dump from a teacher. Before we move on, though, we should talk about the Earth Kingdom labor camps. This concept is completely unique to the show. The cartoon only had labor camps ever owned by the Fire Nation. I think there's 2 big reasons for this. Number 1 is that the Fire Nation and the Earth Kingdom were not on equal footing. The Fire Nation had a huge lead, as they were already unified under a Fire Lord. So, good job creating more inconsistency. What labor are they performing exactly? Clearing rocks with pickaxes? You're an earthbending nation! You sure as shit aren't making them weld things together because you aren't industrialized yet. But the second reason you never saw an Earth Kingdom labor camp in the cartoon was because the Fire Nation was evil. I can't believe I have to spell it out this loud, but they were the bad guys. OMASHU had newly refurbished prisons. Ba Sing Se had dungeons, but not camps. The fact that the Earth Kingdom is employing the same tactics as the Fire Nation means that the show is claiming they are equally as bad. But like, how? How the fuck did that happen? Why the fuck did you let that happen? Why did you decide that the Earth Kingdom has equally as bad practices as the nation that literally genocided the air nomads? Okay, I'm done. Let's talk about Bumi. Bumi is a spiteful person in the show, but given the added realism, it makes a lot of sense. He talks about fighting the same war for 100 years. He talks about diverting food to either orphans or soldiers. He talks about the world falling apart without the Avatar. These were things that were always implied and were a part of the cartoon, but they never took center stage like this. It's different, but I don't think it's bad, especially because Bumi specifically talking about fighting this war for so long is a new and unique idea. It's also one that only could be carried out by him, since Bumi is the only character from Aang's childhood to survive as long as him. Let's keep talking about Bumi since we're already on a roll with him. His journey is quite different from the cartoon, so let's start at the beginning. Revealing that the King of OMASHU is Bumi at the start of his talks with Aang robs the reveal from the end of the episode. I don't necessarily think that's the worst thing, but only because the entire story involving Bumi is different. If the show had kept his intentions of showing Aang that he'll need to think in a unique way, I think this reveal would have not only been important, but necessary for that story to work. Instead, the show has Bumi's story be more about remembering who he was, not who he became due to 100 years of fighting. I think a lot of his spitefulness comes from him having to grow responsible while his friend finally returned to him and didn't have to grow at all. It's a very real reality he's had to live in, and a very dark one too. The example of the orphans or soldiers, that level of what's the word, cruelty? It never existed in the cartoon. In a broad sense, the show makes the story about Boomy, while in the cartoon it makes it about Aang. It's up to you which is better, but I will remind everyone that Aang is the protagonist. This forces the challenges to change, from play my game and I'll free your friend from Boomy, to you're still a good person and I'll fight for it from Aang, which kind of feels strange. I will confidently say that I think it's weaker as an overall season-wide story to have stories not be about Aang. But the reason they would have done it this way is to tell that unique idea, one that we will add to our unique folders idea, 100 Years at War. I will say that a lot of my notes about Boomy are about him being one note. It wasn't terribly uncommon for the cartoon to just pick a character trait for a character and run with it, but the show makes like literally every scene with Boomy one where he's spiteful and angry. It gets a little overwhelming towards the end. Maybe that's what they were going for though, in which case I guess it worked. I have a hard time liking that he just knows that Aang is the Avatar without any testing. I guess I really can't be mad at him since he was around when there were airbenders, so seeing the tattoos would be a dead giveaway. Even still, I liked how the feast played out. It was subversive, it was surprising, it was smart. And the show seems to be taking constant shortcuts for the sake of time, which effectively does two things. One, it makes characters seem less smart and less observant. And two, it removes their agency. I've talked a lot about these topics already, so I'll just let them speak for themselves. So, the big why question. I think the showrunners must have thought that Boomy figuring out on his own was too slow. Or they thought since he's actually 100 years old, of course he would know. But to that I say like, yeah, so what? He's a kooky old man, of course he pretended not to know. I mean, look at his eyebrows raised when he sees Aang for the first time. Of course he knows. That's not the point. It's about the difference between being super obvious with the whole, yeah, he's a crazy old man, and showing it in more subtle ways. And speaking of subtle show don't tell examples, let's talk about Zuko and Iroh.
Well, you're just gonna stand there? What are you gonna do?
I'll just say it. This feels awkward as fuck. I don't know if it's the pacing specifically, like, it seems too fast for me, but it absolutely adds to our tell don't show folder. I didn't know I was making this folder. Zuko had a few moments here and there in the cartoon where he had the opportunity to pursue the Avatar and decided against it, the most prominent being in the storm, as I mentioned. That one felt more organic and real, since he was with his ship and his men and absolutely could have put them in danger to begin the pursuit. So why make the change? Well, spoiler alert, we're not getting the storm in the show. On paper, this sounds like a devastating change. When I think of some of the most impactful episodes of the cartoon, it's the episodes where the characters had time to reflect on their past, confront their decisions. As awesome and incredible as Crossroads of Destiny is, Zuko alone still makes me feel things. But just because we're not getting an entire episode specifically having the storm in it, doesn't mean we can't skip out on its contents. Even in this very episode, we get some show-exclusive flashbacks that really add to our characters, so just because the setup is different doesn't necessarily mean we'll miss out on it. At the worst, it just means it might be more clunky than the storm, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. Well, Zuko's half of it. Pretty much everything involving Aang running away was already covered in episode 1. I do really love the extra attention that Lu Ten got in the show. I think the reason why is that the showrunners have realized that everyone loves Iroh. Like, genuinely, find me someone who dislikes this man. And so showing off more of his past and his trauma and grief can help us connect with him. So this funeral is a big win in my book, even if it belongs to Zuko more than Iroh. I could be negative and say that it's because they're trying to fast-track Zuko's redemption arc, which they definitely are, by the way, but I don't know, man, let me like something for a change. But if the funeral scene belonged to Zuko, the boat casting off belongs to Iroh. So let's talk about Iroh. Firstly, the good. Iroh was a gentle soul in book 1, even if he wasn't willing to go against the Fire Nation until the end of the season. In the storm, he tells the crew about Zuko's banishment, and doesn't make them feel bad for feeling like he's a jerk. The show carries this well enough, but it definitely makes it more of a core part of his personality. My evidence is the kindness he shows to the Earth Kingdom captors. In the cartoon, he didn't experience the elder abuse that he did in the show, and he still had enough of a self-preservation instinct that he decided to fight against them. In the show, he just kinda doesn't. Yes, he fights back when Zuko frees him, but I hate to say that he's just softer in the show. For all the things Iroh was in the cartoon, he was not soft. This man had hard boundaries, and if you crossed them or disappointed him, he wouldn't tell you, he'd show you. Which is ironic, since in talking to the soldiers, he lays up some of the hardest emotional damage I've ever seen.
War pushes us to the edge. Some of us don't like what we find there.
Is that your pitiful way of saying you're sorry?
I wasn't talking about me.
That is not something I would ever expect Iroh to say in the cartoon. I would half expect Iroh to apologize in this situation. They're picking and choosing when he gets to be a wise old man. He didn't dunk on the soldiers or be rude to them in any way. He was rather polite in his escape, and even respectful when he did talk about Ba Sing Se. So it just seems like they're going back and forth on this aspect of his personality. The show is relying on you remembering the end of Iroh's journey more than the beginning, back when he did things like try to free himself and help Zuko hire a bounty hunter. And yeah, I'll be the first one to say that people are complex, so having a character who's both wise and not to be trifled with makes a lot of sense. It just feels less consistent in the show than it did in the cartoon. Oh, and to mention it, in the cartoon, he tells the guards to tighten his restraints and burns one of their hands. This is a smart plan, which the show omits again by removing his escape entirely. Another example of the show cutting parts when our characters need to get smart. Sad face. Now, let's shift to Katara and Sokka and begin with the Cave of Two Lovers. Let's talk broad strokes. The Cave of Two Lovers is in Book 2, Episode 2, in case anyone forgot the quiz from earlier. Book 1 is the Book of Water, and Book 2 is the Book of Earth. The book also dictates a majority of the lessons and world building within it. Book 3, Fire, spends almost the entirety of the time in the Fire Nation colonies. Book 1 spends a lot of time in the North and South Poles, and even has additional time spent with the Water Tribe culture in the forms of the Water Scroll and Bato. It's not an all-dominating rule though, as OMASHU is in Book 1, and so is Aang's first time firebending through Zhongzhong's instruction. But do you know my favorite detail that coincides with each of the books? They also explain the original benders of each element. The Book of Water explains how the waterbenders learned to push and pull the tides from the moon. The Book of Fire explains how dragons were the original firebenders, and the Book of Earth explains how the badger moles were the original earthbenders. All this to say, I don't give a fuck about the badger moles in Book 1. This isn't their book. This book is about water, so it shouldn't be about learning Earth. Why was this changed? For probably the same reason that they put the Cave of Two Lovers in season 1 in the first place. Nostalgia. Name me one person who's familiar with Avatar that doesn't compulsively say secret tunnel if you go through one on a road trip. It's one of the most recognizable moments in Avatar, and the showrunners wanted to exploit that. I don't know if it was because they expected to only have one season, but it's painfully obvious at times. Like bringing the Mechanist and Jet to OMASHU? Like, why are we rushing things if not for that reason specifically? The entire plot about the cave feels like a way to shove in a bunch of references and small moments that keen-eyed viewers will remember from the original cartoon, and I've already pointed out a bunch. It's just fan service bait. Another broad stroke, Oma and Shu are now lesbians, so that's cool. I truly don't care about this change. I imagine the writers thought it would be a little in your face to have Katara tell the story of the man and the woman. It sounds a little antiquated. I think the change is fine, except for something I have to call the bury your gays trope. If you're not familiar with this trope, it's actually really common for gay people in media to either be widows or to have a tragedy strike their partners, leaving, for example, a gay guy whose husband has died, or in this case, a woman whose wife had died. I feel like this was less intentional in this case at least, since they were giving a straight couple story to a lesbian couple, but it's still something I wanted to address anyway. And hey, now you learned a new trope if you didn't know. I also wanted to talk about how, even though the Badger Moles were the first Earthbenders, apparently Oma and Shu were the first humans to learn from them, in both the show and the cartoon. Just in case anybody had watched Legend of Korra and thought that the first Earthbenders came from lion turtles. I'm not gonna be super salty about it for very long. Let's just move on before I get mad. So apparently, these fuckers can sense emotion, and beyond that, respond to verbal commands. So much for not being mad. This is very different than the cartoon, where yes, they responded to music, but you couldn't just tell them to carve a hole in the mountain. So why, other than straight up laziness, make this change? Well, without the nomads, how exactly are we supposed to save these two kids? So the question is really, why didn't the nomads come with? It's different, I suppose. And if they're not going to separate Sokka and Katara, I guess they don't need the extra bodies. But I then point again to how the hell are they gonna get out of this? I don't have the answers sometimes. I think there's a lot of pressure when making an adaptation to not make it an exact copy, and that comes with trying to create some new ideas. Some are good, and some suck. I think this one really sucks. Continuing on with our cave adventures, let's talk about Sokka and Katara. The fight in the caves is exclusive to the show, so why have it then? I think the writers were trying to set up the Spirit World shenanigans in the next episode, and it's continuing on the theme of Mark isn't his father. Wait, sorry, Invincible on the brain. Sokka isn't his father. Sokka trying too hard to be his father is actually a concept remix from the cartoon. Instead, though, it was about Sokka trying too hard to be a warrior, or be the leader of the group. The most prominent example I can think of is how he's the one staying up late to keep watch in episode 15. There's no example of Sokka and Katara having a blow up like this in the cartoon. It's always something handled in the background, or something that has never had a head like this. I don't think it's bad necessarily, I just think it's a sign that the cartoon was able to handle this in a less in-your-face kind of way. And that's kind of all I have to say about these two. But for Team Avatar itself, they actually accomplished something. For what I think is the first time in the show? Saving Boomy from being crushed by the rock. Which, awkward. Aang holds the rock up, Katara creates the ice slide, and Sokka dives in and pushes him out of the way. Everyone has a role to play. It's actually the first time the show really feels like they're working together and using each person's individual strengths. A good example of this happens in The Fortune Teller, episode 14, when they trick the town that the volcano is going to erupt by having Sokka come up with the plan, Katara shape the clouds, and Aang sneaking in to take the Fortune Teller's book. Or in Imprisoned, episode 6, when Katara and Sokka have a fake fight so Aang can airbend a rock and trick the guards into thinking she's an earthbender. Or Bato of the Water Tribe in episode 15, when Aang holds off Zuko and June while Sokka gathers the perfume in the Abbey and Katara waterbends it to douse the Shirshu. Or in episode 12 when, you get the point, this shit happened constantly. The team had each other's backs and would play to their strengths. I feel like I really need to bring it up since this is the first time in the show that it's happening, and it's at the end of episode 4. We're halfway into the season. And I hear you, those of you who may say, well, the show is trying to take it in a different direction, it's not supposed to be episodic. And in which case you're right, but that's also not my fucking problem. But we do have to deal with it anyway. So how do you allow the individual character's strength to peak out when you're telling an ongoing story? Today in my TED Talk, I'll go over because yeah, how the fuck am I supposed to answer that? Writing is hard, don't let anyone tell you differently. However, just because it's hard does not give it a pass for being bad. Now, I'm gonna get a little more in the weeds for this Team Avatar victory, specifically Aang using the fucking force to help hold up that big rock. Take a look at the fucking effort that went into Aang trying to redirect a rock in the cartoon. Bro made a tornado. He's not even moving his arms in the show. Why would he ever do movements if he could just do this? I think the answer is distraction. The show probably thought that if Aang did a complex action, it would be more difficult to follow what they were saying. So how does the cartoon answer this? It does the dialogue after. Like, it's really not not that fucking complicated. It does the action it wants and then has them talk later. Or in the Boomy situation, it specifically has him hold the rock, since earthbending and airbending are different bending forms and can do different things when raising one's hand. Boomy can bend with his fucking face, and Toph can shift the earth with one stomp. Earth and air are different. Airbending isn't the force. While we're on the topic, we need to talk about bullets.
Plus, we fire the whole bullet.
Do you know how many times the cartoon used elements in a way akin to bullets? 2 times. Why is that, you may wonder? The answer is really simple. It was a kid's show. They never showed anyone really dying either, even if death was a really important part of the show. But the show has Boomy turn this rock into knife-shaped rocks, but really bullets in practice, and throws them at Aang. And it has this Earth Kingdom soldier do the same thing with Iroh. So question to you, dear viewer, what are some consequences of making Avatar: The Last Airbender a kid's show? We already listed one, no death on screen. But what's another? No bullets. No guns of any kind, actually. We get swords, axes, arrows, but no guns. So what's the consequence of no guns? That's right, dear viewer, imaginative thinking. Just look at some of the creative fighting moves that Boomy does in the cartoon fight. Look at some of the retorts that Aang does. Look at some of the interesting shit that Master Pakku does to Katara. Look at some of the cool ways Toph trains Aang. Yes, it was a limitation, but the cartoon flourished with it. It enabled some of the coolest fight scenes in media at the time. And they're still fucking cool, don't tell me they're not. As a result, the creativity of the show decreases tremendously now that they can just use elemental bullets as a crutch. And don't worry, this isn't the last time they use it, so we'll be talking about this again. Speaking of fighting styles, I also want to point out that there seems to be a good deal of hand-to-hand fighting that happens in the show compared to the cartoon. I can count on one hand like how many times people actually got punched in the cartoon. I know Katara throws some punches at Pakku in her duel with him, episode 18, but I'm really struggling here. Let me know any other times you guys can remember punches being actually thrown in the cartoon. And I mean Avatar, not Korra. Different example. When Katara confronts Jet in the cartoon, she waterbends at him like 5 times. In the show, she waterbends at him 1 time and then flips him with her hands before that. It feels like the show is missing the point that bending is the star. And lastly, I want to talk about Aang's The Avatar is Back speech. Aang gives his The Avatar has returned speech a few times in the cartoon, but this is like the 4th or 5th time that he does it in the show. It feels like a lot, probably because 4 or 5 times on the cartoon wouldn't have been every other episode, but the show only has 8 episodes, so we're talking like once an episode. It also feels longer than all the times he does it in the cartoon. Maybe that's just personal preference, or again, overexposure since it happens so much in the show, but at this point I'm sick of hearing it. Oh, hi. I didn't expect to end the video here, but we have to if we want to get it out on time. There's still another 4 episodes of this show's god-awful season 1 to talk about, and if you can believe it, they're actually worse than episodes 1 to 4. That video will be coming out soon, so be on the lookout for that. This is a little awkward because I don't really have a conclusion to give yet, as this is just part 1. So thanks for coming, I guess. Special thanks to NordVPN for the sponsorship, and special thanks to my patrons as always, especially my god tier patron Sid Montoya. Again, a reminder that if you want to watch the video without the baby copyright, you can buy it for $1 on my Patreon. The link is in the description. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, but I swear, if even one of you says the show isn't as bad as I think, I'm gonna start ripping my hair out. Part 2 coming very soon. Keep an eye out. Bye!